In the ancient lands where the sun rises over rolling hills, dotted with olive groves, and shepherds tend their flocks beneath star-scattered skies, there lived a man whose heart burned with the fire of divine promise. Jacob, whose name had been changed to Israel after wrestling with the angel of God, dwelt in the land of Canaan with his wives, his servants, and his 12 sons, each one a living branch of the covenant tree that the Almighty had planted through Abraham, Isaac, and now through him. The air in those days carried the scent of frankincense and myrrh from distant trading caravans, and the sound of bleating sheep mingled with the gentle lowing of cattle as the sun painted the horizon in shades of amber and rose. It was a time when God walked close to his people, speaking through dreams and visions, through the whisper of wind in the wilderness and the cry of eagles soaring overhead. Among Jacob's sons, there was one whose spirit seemed to dance with the very breath of heaven itself. Joseph, born to Rachel in her joy after years of barrenness, was a young man of 17 summers when our story begins. His eyes held the depth of still waters, and his heart beat with the rhythm of one who had been chosen for purposes yet unknown. The other brothers saw in him their father's favorite, marked by the coat of many colors that Jacob had fashioned with his own hands, a garment that shimmered like the rainbow after rain, woven with threads of love and hope and divine destiny. Yet, beneath the surface of this pastoral scene, currents of jealousy and pain ran deep. The human heart, even in the most blessed of families, struggles with the weight of favoritism and the burden of comparison. In the tents of Jacob, where the smoke of evening sacrifices rose like incense to the throne of the Most High, a drama was about to unfold that would test the very foundations of faith, family, and the mysterious ways of providence. This is the story of Joseph, beloved son, despised brother, faithful servant, forgotten prisoner, and ultimately, the savior of nations. It is a tale that speaks to the deepest longings of the human soul, the desire to be loved, the pain of rejection, the mystery of suffering, and the ultimate triumph of divine purpose over human frailty. In these pages, we shall walk with Joseph through the valleys of despair and up the mountains of triumph, learning that even in our darkest hours, the hand of the Almighty guides our steps toward a destiny we cannot imagine. Come, let us enter into this sacred narrative, where every tear shed becomes a seed of redemption, and every betrayal serves the greater tapestry of God's unfailing love. The morning mist clung to the hills of Hebron like a prayer ascending to heaven, and young Joseph walked among his father's flocks with the careful steps of one who had learned to listen to the voice of the divine in the bleating of sheep and the whisper of wind through the olive branches. His coat of many colors caught the first rays of sunlight, each thread seeming to hold a piece of the rainbow that God had set in the clouds as a sign of his covenant with Noah generations before. Joseph's brothers worked alongside him, but their hearts were heavy with the weight of resentment that had grown like thorns in a garden meant for flowers. Reuben, the firstborn, watched his younger brother with eyes that held both love and pain, knowing that the birthright that should have been his had somehow slipped through his fingers like sand. Simeon and Levi, their faces marked by the harsh lines of men who had known violence, spoke in whispers when Joseph passed by, their words sharp as the edges of their swords. "See how he walks," muttered Judah, his voice carrying the bitter taste of envy, "as if the very ground beneath his feet is holy." But Joseph, lost in contemplation of the mysteries that stirred in his heart, paid little heed to the murmurs of his brothers. His soul was attuned to something far greater than their disapproval, a sense that the God of his fathers was preparing him for something beyond his understanding. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the world lay still and the stars seemed close enough to touch, Joseph would often find himself overwhelmed by visions that came to him like whispers from eternity. The sheep knew him well, responding to his voice with the trust that comes from gentle care. As he led them to the still waters of a nearby stream, Joseph's mind wandered to the dream that had visited him in the night, a dream so vivid and strange that it seemed to burn itself into his memory like a brand upon his soul. In the dream, he had seen himself and his brothers working in the fields during harvest time, binding sheaves of grain under the golden light of the setting sun. The work was hard but satisfying, the kind of labor that makes a man feel connected to the earth and to the God who causes the seed to grow. But then, as if moved by an invisible hand, his sheaf had risen up and stood tall in the center of the field, while his brothers' sheaves had gathered around it and bowed down, as if in worship or submission. The dream had awakened something deep within Joseph's spirit, not pride, for he was too young and too innocent to fully understand what he had seen, but a sense of wonder and anticipation that made his heart race with excitement. Surely this was more than mere imagination. Surely the God who had appeared to his grandfather Abraham and had wrestled with his father Jacob was speaking to him through the language of dreams. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, painting the landscape in shades of gold and green, Joseph found himself unable to contain the vision that had been given to him. His brothers were gathered around the well, drawing water for the flocks, their faces gleaming with sweat and their hands rough from years of labor. The moment seemed right, the family circle complete, and Joseph's young heart overflowed with the need to share what he had seen. "My brothers," he called out, his voice carrying the clear tones of youth and enthusiasm, "I have had a dream, and I would tell it to you." The brothers looked up from their work, some with mild interest, others with the barely concealed irritation of men who had heard too many of Joseph's unusual tales. But there was something in his voice, a note of authority and wonder that commanded their attention despite their reservations. "We were binding sheaves in the field," Joseph began, his eyes bright with the memory of the vision. "The sun was setting, and the work was nearly done. But then, as I watched, my sheaf arose and stood upright, and behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf." The words hung in the air like incense, heavy with meaning that none of them could fully grasp. For a moment, there was silence except for the gentle lowing of the cattle and the rustle of wind through the acacia trees. Then, slowly, the faces of his brothers began to change, their expressions shifting from curiosity to understanding to something darker and more dangerous. "Do you indeed mean to reign over us?" Reuben's voice was quiet, but there was an edge to it that made Joseph's heart flutter with sudden unease. "Will you indeed rule over us?" The other brothers murmured among themselves, their voices rising like the sound of distant thunder. Joseph saw the anger in their eyes, felt the sudden chill that had fallen over the group, and for the first time began to understand that his dream, beautiful and mysterious as it had seemed, might not be received as the gift he had intended it to be. "I only tell you what I have seen," Joseph said softly, his voice now carrying a note of uncertainty. "I do not understand it myself, only that it seemed to come from the Lord our God." But his words only served to deepen their resentment. In their hearts, they heard not the voice of divine revelation, but the boastful claims of a spoiled younger brother who had been given too much favor and too little wisdom. They saw not a prophet in the making, but a dreamer whose visions threatened to overturn the natural order of their family and their world. As the day wore on and the brothers returned to their work, Joseph walked among them with a growing sense of isolation. The coat of many colors that had once been a symbol of his father's love now felt like a burden, marking him as different, as chosen for something his brothers could not understand or accept. He found himself wondering if he had been wrong to share his dream, if perhaps some visions were meant to be kept in the secret places of the heart until the time was right for their revelation. But even as doubt crept into his young mind, Joseph could not shake the feeling that what he had seen was more than mere fantasy. Deep in his spirit, he sensed the movement of the divine hand, the working of a purpose that stretched far beyond the immediate circumstances of his life. The God who had promised to make his father's descendants as numerous as the stars of heaven was surely at work, even in the midst of family strife and brotherly jealousy. That evening, as the family gathered for the evening meal, Jacob looked upon his sons with eyes that held both love and concern. He had heard whispers of the day's events, had seen the tension that crackled between Joseph and his brothers like lightning before a storm. His heart, already heavy with the weight of favoritism that he knew he should not show, grew heavier still as he contemplated the divisions that were growing within his household. "My sons," he said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of a patriarch who had wrestled with God and prevailed. "We are one family, one people chosen by the Most High. Let us not allow the enemy to sow discord among us." But even as he spoke, Jacob's eyes lingered on Joseph, and the young man felt the weight of his father's love and concern like a warm cloak around his shoulders. In that moment, Joseph understood that he was indeed different, set apart for purposes that he could not yet comprehend. The dreams that came to him were not mere flights of fancy, but messages from the throne of heaven itself. As the stars appeared in the darkening sky, each one a reminder of God's promises to his forefathers, Joseph lay upon his bed and pondered the mysteries of his calling. He did not know what the future held, could not imagine the trials and triumphs that lay ahead, but he knew with the certainty of faith that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had not finished with him yet. The dreams would come again, stranger and more wonderful than before, and with them would come the beginnings of a journey that would take him far from the familiar hills of Canaan into the mysterious land of Egypt, where the ancient pyramids stood as silent witnesses to the power of earthly kingdoms, and where the God of Israel would prove once again that his purposes cannot be thwarted by the plans of men. 7 days had passed since Joseph first shared his dream with his brothers, and the household of Jacob had settled into an uneasy peace. The morning rituals continued as they always had: the milking of the goats, the leading of the flocks to pasture, the tending of the vineyards where clusters of grapes hung heavy with promise. Yet beneath the surface of normalcy, currents of tension flowed like underground streams, occasionally breaking through in harsh words, quickly silenced, or glances that spoke of grievances too deep for easy resolution. Joseph moved through these days with the careful grace of one who has learned that his very presence could spark conflict. He tended his father's sheep with diligent care, spoke softly when addressed, and tried to understand the growing chasm between himself and his brothers. In the quiet hours of the night, when the camp lay still beneath the star-scattered sky, he would often find himself gazing upward, wondering if the God who had spoken to his father at Bethel would speak to him again. The answer came on a night when the moon hung full and bright above the hills of Hebron, casting silver light across the landscape and turning the olive groves into gardens of shadow and mystery. Joseph lay upon his bed, his mind drifting between waking and sleeping, when suddenly the veil between earth and heaven seemed to part, and he found himself once again in the realm of divine vision. This time, the dream was even more magnificent and terrible than the first. He saw himself standing in a vast field under a sky that seemed to pulse with living light. Above him, the sun blazed with golden fire, its rays reaching down to touch his upturned face with warmth and blessing. To his left, the moon glowed with silver radiance, her gentle light complementing the sun's fierce brightness. And all around, scattered across the heavens like jewels upon a royal crown, 11 stars danced in patterns too beautiful for earthly eyes to fully comprehend. But even as Joseph marveled at the celestial display, the scene began to change. Slowly, majestically, the sun and moon and stars began to move, their paths converging until they formed a great circle around him. Then, with a movement that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth, they began to bow down, their light dimming in reverence as they acknowledged some authority greater than their own. Joseph awoke with a gasp, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. The dream had been so vivid, so overwhelming in its implications, that for a moment he could not distinguish between the vision and reality. He sat up in his bed, the rough wool of his blanket scratching against his skin, and tried to make sense of what he had seen. The meaning seemed clear, yet so extraordinary that his young mind could barely grasp it. If the sheaves in his first dream had represented his brothers, then surely the sun and moon and stars represented his father and mother and brothers as well. And if they had bowed down to him in the vision, then... But no, such thoughts were too overwhelming to contemplate. Yet Joseph knew, with the certainty that comes from divine revelation, that he had been given another glimpse into the mysterious purposes of the Almighty. The God who had chosen Abraham to be the father of many nations, who had blessed Isaac with the covenant promise, who had transformed Jacob into Israel. This same God was somehow at work in his own life, preparing him for a destiny that stretched far beyond the hills of Canaan. When morning came with its familiar sounds of awakening animals and stirring family members, Joseph found himself faced with a choice that would prove to be one of the most crucial of his young life. Should he keep this second dream hidden in his heart, learning perhaps from the reaction to his first vision? Or should he share it with his family, trusting that they would understand the divine origin of what he had seen? The decision came to him as he broke his fast with his father and brothers, the bread tasting like sawdust in his mouth as he struggled with the weight of the revelation. Jacob sat at the head of the gathered family, his weathered face serene in the morning light, while the brothers talked quietly among themselves about the day's work ahead. The moment seemed peaceful, filled with the kind of family harmony that Joseph longed to preserve. But the vision burned within him like a coal from the altar, too hot to hold in silence. With the faith of youth and the innocence of one who had not yet learned to fear the reactions of others, Joseph found himself speaking before he could reconsider his words. "My father, my brothers," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the circle of family members. "I have had another dream, and I would share it with you if you will hear it." Jacob looked up from his bread, his eyes immediately focusing on his beloved son with a mixture of interest and concern. He had heard reports of Joseph's first dream and had seen the reaction it had provoked among his other sons. Now, with the wisdom of age and experience, he felt a stirring of unease at the thought of another vision. "Speak, my son," Jacob said quietly, though his heart was already beginning to race with anticipation and dread. Joseph took a deep breath, his eyes bright with the memory of celestial glory. "In my dream, I saw the sun and the moon and 11 stars, and they all bowed down to me." The words fell upon the gathered family like stones thrown into still water, creating ripples of shock and disbelief that spread outward in ever-widening circles. For a moment, no one spoke, the silence broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant bleating of sheep. Then Jacob's voice cut through the stillness like a sword, sharp with reproof and tinged with something that might have been fear. "What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow down to you to the ground?" The patriarch's words carried the authority of one who had wrestled with angels and had received the covenant promises of the Most High. Yet beneath the rebuke, Joseph could hear something else, a note of wonder, perhaps even recognition, as if his father sensed the divine hand at work in these strange visions. But if Jacob recognized the possible significance of Joseph's dreams, his other sons saw only arrogance and presumption. The anger that had been simmering beneath the surface since the first dream now boiled over into open hostility. Simeon's hand moved instinctively to the hilt of his dagger, while Levi's eyes blazed with the fire of righteous indignation. "Does this dreamer think to make himself our God?" Gad muttered, his voice thick with contempt. "First he would rule over us, and now he would have our very father bow down to him." "It is enough," Judah said, his voice carrying the weight of authority that would one day make him the leader of his brothers. "We have heard sufficient foolishness for one morning." But even as the brothers grumbled among themselves, Joseph noticed that his father did not dismiss the dream entirely. Jacob sat in thoughtful silence, his eyes distant, as if he were seeing something beyond the immediate moment. Years of walking with God had taught him to recognize the movement of the divine spirit, even when it came in forms that challenged human understanding. "My son," Jacob said finally, his voice gentler now, but still carrying a note of caution. "These are strange words you speak. Are you certain they come from the Lord our God?" Joseph nodded, his young face earnest with conviction. "I know only what I have seen, my father. The dreams come to me with such clarity that they seem more real than waking life. I believe the God of our fathers is speaking to me, though I do not fully understand what he would have me know." Jacob studied his son's face, seeing there the same intensity of spirit that had once driven him to wrestle with the angel of the Lord until the breaking of the day. Despite the obvious problems that Joseph's revelations were creating within the family, the patriarch could not deny the ring of truth in his words. "Then let us wait upon the Lord to make his purposes clear," Jacob said at last. "In the meantime, perhaps it would be wisdom to keep such visions to yourself until their meaning becomes plain." But the damage had already been done. As the family dispersed to their various tasks, Joseph found himself more isolated than ever from his brothers. They watched him with eyes that held not just resentment now, but something approaching hatred. The dreams that he had shared in innocence had become weapons that his brothers could use against him, proof of his arrogance and presumption. Yet Joseph did not regret his honesty. Deep in his heart, he knew that the visions were not products of his own imagination, but messages from the throne of heaven itself. The God who had appeared to Abraham in the plains of Mamre, who had blessed Isaac at Beersheba, who had revealed himself to Jacob at Bethel. This same God was somehow at work in his life, preparing him for a destiny that he could not yet imagine. As the sun climbed higher in the sky and the heat of the day began to build, Joseph led his father's sheep to a shaded valley where cool water flowed from a spring hidden among the rocks. There, in the solitude of the shepherd's watch, he pondered the mysteries of his calling and prayed for wisdom to understand the path that lay before him. He did not know that even then, in the secret chambers of heaven, the Almighty was weaving a tapestry of events that would soon sweep him far from the familiar hills of Canaan into the land of Egypt, where the dreams of his youth would find their fulfillment in ways too wonderful and terrible for any mortal mind to comprehend. The season of shearing had come to the hill country of Canaan, and with it, the bustle of activity that marked one of the most important times in the shepherd's year. The air was filled with the sounds of bleating sheep, the rhythmic scraping of shears against wool, and the laughter of hired hands who had come from surrounding villages to help with the harvest. It was a time of celebration and hard work, when the fruits of a year's labor would be gathered and the family's prosperity measured in bales of fine wool. But beneath the surface of this seasonal festivity, darker currents were stirring in the hearts of Jacob's sons. The weeks that had passed since Joseph's second dream had done nothing to heal the wounds of jealousy and resentment that his visions had reopened. If anything, the passage of time had only allowed these feelings to fester and grow, like infection in an untreated wound. Joseph, now a young man of 17 summers, moved through the shearing camp with the unconscious grace of one who had grown up among sheep and shepherds. His coat of many colors, now somewhat faded from months of wear, still marked him as his father's favorite, a living reminder of the inequity that his brothers felt so keenly. Yet Joseph himself seemed oblivious to the tension his presence created, his attention focused on the work at hand and the welfare of the flocks. It was Reuben who first noticed the darkness that had settled over his brothers like a shadow. As the eldest, he had always felt responsible for maintaining peace within the family, and the growing hostility toward Joseph troubled him deeply. He watched as Simeon and Levi spoke in hushed tones, their eyes following Joseph's movements with an intensity that made Reuben's heart race with foreboding. "My brothers," Reuben said quietly, approaching the group that had gathered around the evening fire, "I see hatred in your eyes, and it frightens me. Joseph is young and foolish, perhaps, but he is our brother, our father's son." Simeon looked up from the knife he was sharpening, his face hard in the firelight. "Is he indeed our brother? Or has he become something else, a rival, a threat to our inheritance and our peace?" "He dreams of ruling over us," Levi added, his voice bitter with resentment. "He sees himself as our master, while we are meant to be his servants. How long must we endure such arrogance?" Judah, who had been sitting in thoughtful silence, stirred the fire with a stick and watched the sparks rise toward the star-filled sky. "The dreams may be from God," he said slowly. "Father seems to think so, at least. But what kind of God would choose the youngest among us to rule over his elders?" "The same God who chose Jacob over Esau," Reuben pointed out, though his voice carried little conviction. "The ways of the Almighty are not our ways, and his thoughts are not our thoughts." But his words fell on deaf ears. The brothers had nursed their grievances too long to be easily swayed by appeals to divine wisdom. In their hearts, they had already begun to see Joseph not as a brother blessed by God, but as an obstacle to their own happiness and prosperity. As the night deepened and the camp settled into sleep, the brothers continued their whispered conversations around the dying fire. They spoke of the unfairness of their father's favoritism, of the arrogance they saw in Joseph's manner, of the threat his dreams posed to the natural order of their family. With each passing hour, their resentment grew stronger, fed by the dark imaginings of men who had allowed jealousy to poison their hearts. It was Gad who first spoke the words that hung unspoken in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. What if Joseph were to disappear? What if some accident were to befall him while he tended the flocks? The suggestion hung in the air like a serpent ready to strike. For a moment, no one spoke, each brother wrestling with the enormity of what had been proposed. Then, slowly, other voices began to join in, adding their own dark thoughts to the conspiracy that was taking shape in the shadows. "He wanders far from camp when he tends the sheep," Asher observed. "Wild beasts roam these hills. Accidents happen." "Father would grieve," Naphtali said, though his voice held more calculation than concern. "But grief passes, and without Joseph, there would be no more dreams, no more talk of bowing down to our younger brother." Only Reuben remained silent, his heart heavy with the weight of what he was hearing. As the eldest, he knew that he bore responsibility for his brother's actions, and the thought of violence against Joseph filled him with dread. Yet he also understood the depth of their resentment, and feared what they might do if their anger continued to grow unchecked. The next morning brought news that would soon provide the brothers with the opportunity they had been unconsciously seeking. A messenger arrived from the northern pastures, where some of the family's flocks had been taken for fresh grazing. The man spoke of problems with the local inhabitants, of disputes over water rights and grazing boundaries that required the attention of Jacob's sons. "You must go to Shechem," Jacob told his sons as they gathered for the morning meal. "The flocks need your guidance, and these disputes must be resolved before they grow into something more serious." The brothers nodded their agreement, their hearts already racing with anticipation. Shechem was far from their father's camp, far from the watchful eyes of Jacob and his household. If they were going to act on their dark impulses, the journey would provide the perfect opportunity. As the brothers prepared for their departure, gathering supplies and making ready their donkeys, Joseph approached his father with a question that would unknowingly seal his fate. "Father," he said, his voice carrying the eager tone of youth, "may I go with my brothers to Shechem? I know the flocks well, and perhaps I could be of help to them." Jacob looked upon his beloved son with eyes that held both love and concern. Something in the manner of his other sons troubled him, a tension that he could not quite identify, but that made him reluctant to let Joseph leave his sight. "The journey is long and dangerous," Jacob said carefully. "Perhaps it would be better if you remained here, where I can keep watch over you." But Joseph, with the enthusiasm of youth and the desire to prove himself worthy of his brother's respect, pressed his case. "I am no longer a child, father. I can handle myself in the wilderness, and my brothers may need my help with the flocks." Jacob studied his son's face, seeing there the same determination that had once driven him to wrestle with the angel of the Lord. Despite his misgivings, he found himself nodding slowly. "Very well," he said at last, "but stay close to your brothers, and return to me quickly if there is any sign of trouble." Joseph's face lit up with joy, and he embraced his father with the warmth of a son who had been granted a great favor. He could not know that this moment of happiness would be his last in his father's house, that the journey he was so eager to undertake would lead him into trials and adventures beyond his wildest imagination. As the brothers set out from their father's camp, leading their donkeys and driving their flocks toward the northern pastures, Joseph walked among them with a light heart. The morning was beautiful, with clear skies and gentle breezes that carried the scent of wild flowers and growing grain. He tried to engage his brothers in conversation, to share with them his excitement about the journey ahead, but found them strangely distant and preoccupied. The truth was that with each step they took away from their father's camp, the darkness in the brothers' hearts grew stronger. The conspiracy that had been born around the evening fire was now taking concrete shape, and the opportunity they had waited for was finally at hand. As they traveled through the wilderness, passing landmarks that had been familiar to their family for generations, the brothers spoke in whispers and glances, their plans crystallizing with each passing mile. They had crossed a line from which there could be no return, and the innocent young man who walked among them, humming softly to himself as he watched the play of sunlight on the hills, had no idea that his very life hung in the balance. The God who had spoken to Joseph in dreams was watching over this journey with eyes that saw all things, and the purposes of heaven were being worked out even through the jealousy and hatred of earthly brothers. But Joseph, in his innocence and youth, could not yet see the hand of providence that was guiding his steps toward a destiny that would ultimately bring salvation to the very brothers who now plotted his destruction. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and the little caravan pressed on toward Shechem, carrying with it the seeds of a drama that would unfold across years and continents, touching the lives of nations and revealing the mysterious ways in which the Almighty can bring good out of evil, light out of darkness, and redemption out of the deepest human betrayal. The sun had passed its zenith and was beginning its slow descent toward the western horizon when the brothers reached the ancient well of Dothan. The place was known to every shepherd in the region, a reliable source of water in the midst of the wilderness, surrounded by grazing lands that had sustained flocks for countless generations. Here, caravans would often stop to rest and water their animals, and here the sons of Jacob paused to consider what they would do with their brother Joseph. Joseph, unaware of the danger that surrounded him, had spent the morning trying to bridge the gulf between himself and his brothers. He had shared bread with them, helped tend the flocks, and spoken of his desire to prove himself worthy of their respect. But his efforts had been met with cold silence and averted eyes, leaving him confused and hurt by their rejection. As the afternoon heat began to build, the brothers found themselves alone with Joseph in the vast expanse of the wilderness. The nearest settlement was miles away, and the isolation of the place seemed to whisper of dark possibilities. It was then that the conspiracy that had been brewing in their hearts finally burst forth like a dam breaking under pressure. "Look," said Simeon, pointing to a figure approaching in the distance. "Here comes the dreamer." The words were spoken with such venom that Joseph felt a chill run down his spine despite the heat of the day. He looked from one brother to another, seeing in their faces an expression he had never seen before, a cold hatred that seemed to transform them into strangers. "My brothers," Joseph said uncertainly, his voice carrying the tremor of growing fear. "What troubles you? Have I done something to offend you?" But his words only seemed to inflame their anger. Levi stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his dagger, and spoke the words that would shatter Joseph's world forever. "Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of these pits. We will say that a wild beast has devoured him, and we shall see what becomes of his dreams." The words hung in the air like a death sentence, and Joseph felt the blood drain from his face as the full meaning of what his brother had said sank into his consciousness. These were not the words of frustrated siblings, but of men who had crossed the line into murderous intent. "Kill me," Joseph whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind that rustled through the dry grass. "But why? What have I done to deserve death?" "You have dreamed," Judah said, his voice carrying the weight of judgment. "You have set yourself above us, claimed authority over your elders, and brought division into our father's house. These are crimes that cannot be forgiven." Joseph looked around the circle of his brothers, searching desperately for even one face that might show mercy or compassion. But what he saw there filled him with despair. Eyes that had once held familial love now blazed with the fire of hatred and jealousy. It was then that Reuben, who had been standing apart from the others, stepped forward. The eldest son of Jacob had wrestled with his conscience throughout the journey, and now, faced with the reality of his brother's intentions, he found himself unable to remain silent. "We must not take his life," Reuben said firmly, his voice carrying the authority of his birthright. "Shed no blood. Cast him into this pit here in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand upon him." The other brothers looked at Reuben with surprise and suspicion. They had expected him to join in their conspiracy, not to oppose it. But Reuben's words carried weight, and they found themselves considering his proposal. "A pit?" Gad mused, looking toward the ancient cistern that had been carved into the rock nearby. "Yes, that would serve our purpose well. He would be removed from our path, but we would not have his blood on our hands." Joseph's heart leaped with a mixture of terror and desperate hope. A pit was certainly preferable to immediate death, but he knew that being thrown into one of the deep cisterns of the wilderness was often tantamount to a death sentence. Few travelers passed this way, and even fewer would think to look into an abandoned pit for a victim. "Please," Joseph said, his voice breaking with emotion. "I am your brother, flesh of your flesh. If I have offended you, I will make amends. But do not do this thing. Think of our father, how his heart would break if he knew what you intended." But his pleas fell on deaf ears. The brothers had already made their decision, and the mention of their father's love for Joseph only served to fuel their resentment. They saw in his words not genuine remorse, but manipulation, an attempt to use Jacob's favoritism as a shield against the consequences of his arrogance. "Strip him of his robe," Simeon commanded, his voice harsh with satisfaction. "Let us see how the dreamer looks without his coat of many colors." The brothers fell upon Joseph with hands that showed no mercy, tearing away the beautiful garment that had been his father's gift. The coat that had once been a symbol of love and favor now lay in tatters on the ground, its bright colors stained with dust and tears. Joseph stood before them in his simple tunic, his young body trembling with fear and shock. The physical pain of their rough handling was nothing compared to the agony in his heart as he realized that the brothers he had loved and trusted were capable of such cruelty. "The pit," Levi said, gesturing toward the ancient cistern. "Let us be done with this business." The pit was deep and narrow, carved into the solid rock by ancient hands. It had once held water for the use of shepherds and travelers, but now it was dry and empty, its depths lost in shadow. Joseph looked down into that darkness and felt his soul shrivel with despair. "Please," he whispered one last time, his voice barely audible. "I will go away. I will leave our father's house and never return. Only do not do this thing." But the brothers had passed beyond the point of mercy. They seized Joseph by his arms and legs, and despite his struggles and cries, they carried him to the edge of the pit. For a moment, he hung suspended over the abyss, his eyes wide with terror as he looked into the faces of the men who had once been his protectors. Then, with a movement that seemed to happen in slow motion, they released him. Joseph fell through the darkness, his cry echoing off the stone walls as he tumbled toward the bottom of the pit. The sound of his body hitting the ground was followed by an awful silence that seemed to stretch on forever. The brothers stood around the edge of the pit, looking down into the darkness where their brother had disappeared. For a long moment, none of them spoke, each man wrestling with the enormity of what they had just done. The silence was broken only by the distant bleating of sheep and the whisper of wind through the dry grass. From the depths of the pit came the sound of Joseph's voice, weak and pleading. "My brothers, please, pull me up. I am hurt, and I cannot climb out on my own." The words cut through the desert air like a blade, and for a moment, some of the brothers felt their resolve waver. But then Simeon stepped forward and rolled a large stone over the mouth of the pit, muffling Joseph's cries and sealing him in darkness. "It is done," Simeon said, his voice carrying a note of finality. "The dreamer will dream no more." Reuben, who had hoped to return later and rescue Joseph from the pit, watched in horror as his brothers sealed their victim's fate. His plan had been to wait until the others were distracted, then return to free Joseph and help him escape to safety. But now, with the stone in place, such a rescue would be impossible without the others' knowledge. "We should eat," Judah said, his voice strangely casual considering what had just transpired. "The day is hot, and we have worked hard. Let us take our meal and decide what to do next." It was a testament to the hardness of their hearts that the brothers could indeed sit down to eat while their brother lay trapped in the darkness below. They spread their provisions on the ground and began to break bread, their conversation carefully avoiding any mention of Joseph or what they had done to him. But even as they ate, their eyes were drawn repeatedly to the sealed pit, and each man found the food tasteless in his mouth. The weight of their deed pressed down upon them like a physical burden, and they began to realize that the satisfaction they had expected to feel was nowhere to be found. It was then that Issachar, who had been keeping watch over the surrounding countryside, called out in excitement, "Look, a caravan approaches from the north!" The brothers looked up to see a line of camels moving slowly across the desert landscape, their bells jingling softly in the afternoon breeze. As the caravan drew closer, they could see that it was a company of Ishmaelite traders, their animals loaded with goods bound for the markets of Egypt. "They carry spices and myrrh," Zebulun observed, shading his eyes against the sun, "and balm from Gilead. These are merchants of substance, traveling the ancient trade routes." The sight of the caravan sparked an idea in Judah's mind, an idea that would prove to be providential, though he could not know it at the time. He looked at his brothers, then at the sealed pit, and felt a stirring of something that might have been conscience or might have been simple pragmatism. "My brothers," Judah said slowly, "what profit is there in killing our brother and concealing his blood? Come, let us sell him to these Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother, our flesh." The suggestion hung in the air like a lifeline thrown to drowning men. The brothers looked at each other, seeing in their faces the same mixture of guilt and relief that they felt in their own hearts. Here was a way to rid themselves of Joseph without having his blood on their hands, and perhaps even to profit from his removal. "But we have already thrown him into the pit," Gad pointed out. "How can we sell what is already dead?" "Is he dead?" Judah asked pointedly. "Have we heard no sound from below? Perhaps our brother yet lives, and if so, we can still change our course." Reuben, who had been listening to this exchange with growing hope, stepped forward eagerly. "Yes, let us see if he lives. If he does, then surely this caravan is a sign from the Almighty that we should choose a different path." With trembling hands, the brothers rolled away the stone that sealed the pit. Immediately, Joseph's voice rose from the depths, weak but unmistakably alive. "My brothers, thank God you have returned. Please, I am injured and cannot climb out alone. Lower a rope, I beg you." The sound of their brother's voice filled the brothers with a complex mixture of relief and renewed guilt. They had been prepared to live with his death, but faced with evidence of his continued life, they found themselves unable to complete their murderous intent. "We will pull you up," Reuben called down, his voice thick with emotion. "But you must promise to do exactly as we say." "Anything," came Joseph's desperate reply. "I will do anything you ask, only please do not leave me here to die." The brothers lowered a rope into the pit, and with considerable effort, pulled Joseph up into the light. He emerged battered and bruised, his clothes torn, and his face streaked with dirt and tears. But his eyes, though filled with pain and confusion, still held the spark of life and hope. Joseph looked around at his brothers, trying to understand what had changed their minds. He saw the approaching caravan and felt a flutter of unease, but was so grateful to be out of the pit that he did not immediately grasp the significance of the trader's arrival. "My brothers," he said, his voice hoarse from crying out in the darkness, "I know I have displeased you, but surely we can find a way to make peace between us. I am willing to—" "Silence," Simeon commanded harshly. "You will speak only when spoken to. Your fate is no longer in your hands." It was then that Joseph saw the calculating look in his brother's eyes and understood that his rescue from the pit had not been motivated by mercy or remorse. A new terror began to grow in his heart as he realized that one form of destruction had merely been replaced by another. The Ishmaelite caravan had drawn close enough now that individual faces could be distinguished among the traders. They were men of the desert, weathered and wise in the ways of commerce, their eyes sharp for opportunity and profit. Their leader, a man named Medan, raised his hand in greeting as he approached the brothers. "Peace be with you, sons of Jacob," Medan called out, for the family's reputation was known throughout the region. "We are bound for Egypt with goods for the markets of Memphis and Thebes. Do you have anything you would trade?" Judah stepped forward, his heart pounding with the weight of what he was about to do. "We have something that might interest you," he said carefully. "A young man, strong and intelligent, who would serve well as a slave in the households of Egypt." Joseph's blood turned to ice in his veins as he finally understood his brother's true intentions. The pit had been terrible, but this was a living death, a fate that would tear him away from everything he had ever known and loved. "No," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Please, not this. Kill me if you must, but do not sell me into slavery." But his pleas fell on deaf ears. The transaction was already underway, with Medan examining Joseph as he would any piece of merchandise. The trader's experienced eyes took in the young man's obvious intelligence and physical condition, and he nodded approvingly. "He is indeed a fine specimen," Medan said. "What price do you ask?" 20 pieces of silver, Judah replied, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his heart. "He is well educated and comes from good stock. He will serve his master faithfully." The negotiation was brief and businesslike. Medan was skilled in the art of commerce, but he could see that the brothers were eager to complete the transaction. Within minutes, the silver had changed hands, and Joseph found himself bound with ropes and loaded onto one of the camels like a sack of grain. As the caravan prepared to resume its journey, Joseph looked back at his brothers one last time. He saw in their faces a mixture of relief, guilt, and something that might have been regret. But none of them would meet his eyes, and none of them spoke a word of farewell. "Remember me," Joseph called out as the caravan began to move. "Remember me to our father, and tell him that I love him still, despite what has happened here." But the brothers turned away, unable to bear the sight of their brother's anguish. They had achieved their goal. Joseph was removed from their lives forever, but the victory tasted like ashes in their mouths. As the caravan disappeared into the shimmering heat of the desert, carrying Joseph toward an uncertain future in the land of Egypt, the brothers stood in silence around the empty pit. The deed was done, and there could be no taking it back. They had sold their brother into slavery, betrayed their father's trust, and shattered the unity of their family. But even as they contemplated the magnitude of their sin, they could not know that they had also become unwitting instruments in the fulfillment of a divine purpose. The God who had spoken to Joseph in dreams was still watching over him, still guiding his steps toward a destiny that would ultimately bring salvation not only to Joseph himself, but to the very brothers who had betrayed him. The sun continued its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. And in the growing darkness of the desert night, the seeds of a great redemption were already beginning to take root in the soil of human suffering and divine love. As the dust from the departing caravan settled and the sound of camel bells faded into the distance, the brothers of Joseph found themselves standing in the wilderness with the weight of their deed pressing down upon them like a physical burden. The 20 pieces of silver that Judah had received for his brother's life lay heavy in his purse, each coin a reminder of the price they had placed on flesh and blood. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded them of Joseph's coat of many colors. The irony was not lost on any of them, and they found themselves unable to look at the horizon without being reminded of what they had done. "We must return to our father," Reuben said finally. his voice heavy with the weight of leadership he had failed to exercise. "He will be expecting word of our journey, and our long absence will have worried him." But even as he spoke, the practical problems of their situation began to dawn on them. How could they return to Jacob without Joseph? What explanation could they give for his absence that would not reveal their guilt? The brothers looked at each other with growing panic as they realized that disposing of Joseph had been only the beginning of their troubles. "We cannot simply say he is gone," Asher pointed out, his voice tight with anxiety. "Father will demand to know what happened to him. He will search for him, send messengers to every corner of the land. We need a story that will satisfy his questions and end his searching." It was Simeon who first spoke the words that would seal their fate as liars as well as betrayers. "We must convince him that Joseph is dead," he said coldly. "Only then will he stop looking for him." The brothers stared at their brother in silence, each man wrestling with the implications of what he had suggested. They had already crossed the line from jealousy to violence, from brotherhood to betrayal. Now they were being asked to cross yet another line, from deception to the cruelest kind of lie a father could hear. "But how?" Naphtali asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What evidence can we provide that will convince him?" It was then that Levi's eyes fell upon the torn remnants of Joseph's coat, which still lay on the ground where they had stripped it from him. The beautiful garment that had been Jacob's gift to his beloved son now seemed to mock them with its faded colors and tattered fabric. "The coat," Levi said slowly, an idea beginning to form in his mind. "We can use the coat." Judah followed his brother's gaze and immediately understood. "Yes," he said, his voice gaining strength as the plan took shape. "We can make it appear that Joseph was killed by a wild beast. Father will believe the evidence of his own eyes." The brothers gathered around the torn garment, their faces grim with determination. They had committed themselves to this course of action, and there could be no turning back now. With methodical efficiency, they began to prepare the evidence that would convince their father of his favorite son's death. "We need blood," Gad said practically. "The coat must be torn and bloodied if we are to make this deception believable." Without hesitation, the brothers caught one of the young goats from their flock and killed it, not for food or sacrifice, but for the dark purpose of deception. They dipped Joseph's coat in the animal's blood, tore it further to simulate the attack of a wild beast, and trampled it in the dust until it looked like the remnant of a violent struggle. As they worked, none of them spoke of the horror of what they were doing. They had become men possessed by their own guilt and fear, willing to compound their sins rather than face the consequences of their actions. The coat that had once been a symbol of their father's love was being transformed into an instrument of his destruction. When their grisly work was complete, they looked upon what they had created with a mixture of satisfaction and revulsion. The bloodied, torn garment was indeed convincing evidence of a violent death. No father looking upon such a sight could doubt that his son had met a terrible end. "It is done," Simeon said, his voice carrying a note of finality. "Now we must prepare ourselves to be convincing actors in the drama we have created." The brothers spent the remainder of the evening rehearsing their story, making sure that every detail was consistent and believable. They spoke of Joseph going out alone to search for strayed sheep, of finding only this bloodied remnant of his coat, of the signs of struggle they had discovered. They practiced their expressions of grief and shock, knowing that their father's sharp eyes would be watching for any sign of deception. As the stars appeared in the darkening sky, the brothers made their camp for the night. But sleep came hard to men whose consciences were burdened with such weight. They lay on their bedrolls, staring up at the vast expanse of heaven, and wondered if the God of their fathers was watching their deeds with displeasure. The next morning brought the dreaded journey home. As they gathered their flocks and prepared to depart, each brother felt the weight of what awaited them. They would have to look into their father's eyes and lie to him about the fate of his most beloved son. They would have to maintain their deception in the face of his grief and continue to live with the knowledge of what they had done. The journey back to Hebron seemed to take forever, each mile stretching out like an eternity. The brothers spoke little, lost in their own thoughts and fears. The bloodied coat lay wrapped in cloth among their possessions, a constant reminder of the lie they were carrying home. As they approached the familiar hills of their father's territory, they could see the smoke from the cooking fires rising into the morning air. Soon they would be home, and the most difficult part of their deception would begin. Jacob was waiting for them at the entrance to his tent, his face bright with anticipation. He had been watching for their return, eager to hear news of the flocks and to see his beloved Joseph again. The sight of his approaching sons filled his heart with joy, but that joy quickly turned to concern when he realized that Joseph was not among them. "My sons," Jacob called out, his voice carrying across the camp, "you have returned safely, but where is Joseph? Why do I not see him with you?" The brothers exchanged glances, each one steeling himself for the performance they were about to give. Judah, as the spokesman for the group, stepped forward with the wrapped bundle in his hands. "Father," Judah said, his voice carefully modulated to convey grief and shock, "we have brought you something that we found in the wilderness. Please, examine it and tell us if you recognize it." With trembling hands, Jacob took the bundle and unwrapped it. The sight that greeted his eyes was so shocking, so terrible, that for a moment he could not speak. There, bloody and torn, was the coat of many colors that he had made with his own hands for his beloved son. "This is Joseph's coat," Jacob whispered, his voice breaking with anguish. "Where did you find it? Where is my son?" The brothers launched into their carefully rehearsed story, describing how they had found the bloodied garment in a remote valley, how they had searched for Joseph but found only signs of struggle and the tracks of wild beasts. They painted a picture of a violent death that left no room for hope or doubt. Jacob listened to their words with growing horror, his face growing pale as the implications sank in. His hands shook as he held the torn coat, and tears began to stream down his weathered cheeks. "Joseph is dead," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "My son is dead, torn to pieces by wild beasts. The coat does not lie. This is his blood, his death." The sound of their father's anguish was like a knife in the brothers' hearts. They had achieved their goal, but the victory was more bitter than they had imagined. To see the man who had given them life broken by grief over the son they had betrayed was almost more than they could bear. Jacob tore his own garments in the traditional sign of mourning and threw himself upon the ground in the depths of his grief. "Joseph, my son," he cried out, his voice carrying across the camp and striking terror into the hearts of all who heard it. "Would God I had died instead of you!" The brothers stood around their father, making gestures of comfort and support that felt like mockery in their own hearts. They had stolen not only Joseph's freedom, but their father's joy, and the weight of both crimes pressed down upon them like a mountain. For days, Jacob refused to be comforted. He sat in the ashes of his grief, weeping for the son he believed was dead, while his other sons watched in growing torment. They had thought that removing Joseph from their lives would bring them peace, but instead it had brought them only guilt and the constant fear of discovery. The irony was cruel and complete. In their jealousy of their father's love for Joseph, they had destroyed the very thing they had sought to protect. Jacob's grief was so complete, so overwhelming, that he seemed to age years in a matter of days. The vital, energetic patriarch who had wrestled with angels became a broken old man who could find no comfort in life. And through it all, the brothers had to maintain their deception, offering comfort they did not feel and grief they had caused. They had become prisoners of their own lie, bound by chains of guilt and fear that would follow them for the rest of their lives. But even as Jacob mourned and the brothers struggled with their guilt, the God of their fathers was still at work. In the land of Egypt, Joseph was beginning a journey that would test his faith, refine his character, and ultimately prepare him for a destiny that none of them could imagine. The betrayal that had seemed to end his story was actually the beginning of a greater tale of redemption and providence. The coat of many colors lay buried with Jacob's tears, but the dreams that had once adorned Joseph's sleep were still alive in the heart of the Almighty. And in the fullness of time, those dreams would be fulfilled in ways that would bring healing to a broken family and salvation to a starving world. The sun blazed mercilessly overhead as the Ishmaelite caravan wound its way through the scorching desert toward the ancient land of Egypt. Joseph, bound and loaded like cargo upon one of the camels, felt each mile stretch before him like an eternity of suffering. His body ached from the awkward position and the rough treatment he had received, but the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the anguish in his heart. With each passing hour, the familiar hills of Canaan grew more distant, and with them, everything he had ever known or loved. The tent of his father, the flocks he had tended, the graves of his forefathers, all were disappearing behind him like a dream upon waking. He was no longer Joseph, the beloved son of Jacob, but a piece of merchandise being carried to market in a foreign land. The other slaves in the caravan were a mixture of nationalities and circumstances. Some had been captured in raids, others had sold themselves to pay debts, and still others had been born into slavery and knew no other life. They looked upon Joseph with a mixture of pity and curiosity, seeing in his obvious grief the fresh wounds of one newly torn from freedom. "Where do you come from, young one?" asked an elderly Syrian slave who had been chained next to Joseph. His voice was kind despite the hardness of his circumstances, and his eyes held the wisdom of one who had learned to find peace even in bondage. "From the land of Canaan," Joseph replied, his voice hoarse from thirst and sorrow. "My father is Jacob, whom God renamed Israel. I was his son." The old man nodded with understanding. "I too was once a free man with a family and a name, but the God of heaven watches over us even in our bondage. Do not despair, young one. Sometimes the path to our destiny leads through valleys we would never choose to walk." Joseph found some comfort in the old man's words, though he could not imagine how his present circumstances could possibly be part of any divine plan. The dreams that had once filled him with hope now seemed like cruel mockeries, visions of a future that had been stolen from him by his brother's betrayal. As the caravan pressed on through the desert, Joseph had time to think about the events that had brought him to this pass. The jealousy in his brothers' eyes, the coldness in their voices, the violence of their actions, all of it seemed like a nightmare from which he could not wake. He wondered if his father had discovered his absence yet, if he was searching for him, if he would ever see the familiar tents of home again. The days blurred together in a haze of heat, thirst, and despair. Joseph's lips cracked from the dry air, and his skin burned under the relentless sun. But gradually, as the caravan moved deeper into the desert, he began to sense a change in the landscape and the people around him. The air grew different, carrying scents of a great river and the mysterious perfumes of an ancient civilization. "Egypt," breathed one of the other slaves, his voice filled with a mixture of fear and wonder. "The land of the pharaohs." Joseph lifted his head to look ahead, and his breath caught in his throat. Before them stretched a sight that defied description, a vast river that flowed like a ribbon of silver through the desert, and beyond it, the greatest civilization the world had ever known. The Nile Delta spread out like a green jewel set in the brown crown of the desert, its fields and cities teeming with life and activity. But it was the sight of the Great Pyramids that truly took Joseph's breath away. Rising from the desert like man-made mountains, they stood as eternal monuments to the power and ambition of the pharaohs. Their smooth sides caught the light of the setting sun and seemed to glow with an inner fire, proclaiming to all who saw them that this was a land where men had learned to touch the very heavens. The caravan crossed the Nile on great barges that groaned under the weight of camels, slaves, and merchandise. Joseph watched in fascination as the dark waters of the river flowed past, carrying with them the lifeblood of Egypt. Along the banks, farmers worked their fields with the patient rhythm of those who had learned to trust in the annual flooding that brought fertility to the land. "The Nile is their god," the old Syrian slave explained, seeing Joseph's interest. "Every year it floods and brings life to the desert. Without it, Egypt would be nothing but sand and stone." As they entered the great city of Memphis, Joseph's senses were overwhelmed by the sights, sounds, and smells of Egyptian civilization. The streets were crowded with people of every description: nobles in fine linen, craftsmen carrying their tools, slaves bent under heavy burdens, and priests with shaved heads and flowing robes. The buildings were magnificent, beyond anything Joseph had ever imagined, their walls covered with colorful paintings and hieroglyphs that told the stories of gods and pharaohs. The slave market was located in a large square near the center of the city, and it was here that Joseph's fate would be decided. The Ishmaelite traders were experienced in the business of human commerce, and they knew how to present their merchandise to best advantage. Joseph was cleaned, given fresh clothing, and instructed in how to behave when potential buyers examined him. "Stand straight," Madan commanded, his voice businesslike and efficient. "Show your strength and intelligence. The better the price you bring, the better your chances of finding a good master." Joseph wanted to rebel against the very idea of being sold like an animal, but he also understood that his survival might depend on the quality of his purchaser. A kind master might offer him some hope of eventual freedom, while a cruel one could make his life a living hell. The auction began at dawn, with hundreds of slaves being offered to the highest bidders. Joseph watched in horror as families were separated, children torn from their parents, and human beings reduced to mere property. When his turn came, he stood on the auction block with as much dignity as he could muster, trying to ignore the calculating eyes of the potential buyers. The bidding for Joseph was spirited, as his obvious intelligence and physical condition made him attractive to several buyers. But it was one man in particular who caught Joseph's attention, a tall, dignified Egyptian with kind eyes and the bearing of nobility. He was expensively dressed, but not ostentatiously so, and there was something in his manner that suggested both authority and compassion. "I am Potiphar," the man said, when the bidding was complete and he had purchased Joseph for a considerable sum. "I am captain of the guard to Pharaoh himself. You will serve in my household, and if you prove faithful, you will be treated well." Joseph felt a flutter of hope at these words. To serve in the household of such a man was surely better than laboring in the fields or mines. As he was led away from the slave market, he caught a glimpse of the old Syrian slave who had befriended him during the journey. The man smiled and nodded, as if to say that this was indeed a stroke of good fortune. The house of Potiphar was a marvel of Egyptian architecture and luxury. Built around a central courtyard with fountains and gardens, it was designed to provide coolness and beauty in the midst of the desert heat. The walls were decorated with elaborate frescoes depicting scenes from Egyptian mythology, and the rooms were furnished with items of exquisite craftsmanship. Joseph was assigned to work under the household steward, an elderly Egyptian named Kaimwasit, who had served Potiphar's family for many years. The old man was stern but fair, and he quickly recognized Joseph's unusual abilities. "You are not like the other slaves," Kaimwasit observed, after Joseph had been in the household for several weeks. "You think before you act, and you learn quickly. Where did you acquire such wisdom?" "From my father," Joseph replied, his voice catching slightly at the memory. "He taught me to fear the Lord and to conduct myself with honor, even in difficult circumstances." Kaimwasit nodded approvingly. "Your God has blessed you with great gifts. Use them well, and you may find that even slavery can become a stepping stone to greater things." Indeed, Joseph seemed to thrive in his new environment despite his circumstances. He learned to read and write Egyptian hieroglyphs, mastered the complex business of managing a large household, and won the respect of both his fellow servants and his master. There was something about him that seemed to bring blessing wherever he went. The household ran more smoothly, the accounts balanced better, and even the gardens seemed to flourish under his care. Potiphar himself began to take notice of this remarkable young slave. He saw how Joseph's presence seemed to bring order out of chaos, how his fellow servants looked to him for guidance, and how the very atmosphere of the household seemed lighter and more harmonious when Joseph was present. "This Hebrew brings the blessing of his God with him," Potiphar confided to his wife one evening as they walked in their garden. "Since he has been in our house, everything has prospered. I am thinking of giving him greater responsibilities." And so it was that Joseph, who had been sold as a slave by his own brothers, began to rise in the household of Potiphar. His intelligence, integrity, and obvious divine favor marked him as a man destined for greater things. The God who had spoken to him in dreams was clearly at work in his life, using even the betrayal of his brothers to position him for a purpose that was yet to be revealed. But Joseph's trials were far from over. The prosperity and favor he enjoyed in Potiphar's house would soon be tested in ways that would challenge his faith and his character to their very foundations. The God who had allowed him to be sold into slavery had not forgotten him, but neither had he finished refining him for the great work that lay ahead. As Joseph lay on his simple bed in the servants' quarters, looking up at the same stars that shone over his father's tents in Canaan, he whispered a prayer of gratitude for the mercies he had received. He did not know what tomorrow would bring, but he was learning to trust in the God who had promised to never leave him nor forsake him, even in the darkest hours of his journey. The dreams of his youth seemed far away now, almost like visions from another lifetime. But deep in his heart, Joseph knew that the God who had given him those dreams was still sovereign over his destiny. Whatever trials lay ahead, whatever purposes were yet to be fulfilled, he would face them with the faith and integrity that his father had taught him, trusting that the Almighty would make his will known in his perfect time. 2 years had passed since Joseph had first entered the household of Potiphar, and in that time he had risen from a common slave to the most trusted servant in the entire establishment. His master had come to rely on him for everything: the management of the household, the oversight of the fields, the handling of business matters, and even personal affairs. So complete was Potiphar's trust in Joseph that he had essentially turned over the entire operation of his estate to the young Hebrew's capable hands. "I concern myself with nothing except the food that I eat," Potiphar had told his friends, only half joking. "Joseph manages everything else, and manages it better than I ever could myself." The transformation in Joseph's circumstances might have seemed miraculous to an outside observer, but those who knew him well understood that it was the natural result of his character and abilities. He approached every task with diligence and integrity, treated his fellow servants with fairness and kindness, and conducted himself with a dignity that commanded respect from all who encountered him. The other servants in the household had initially been suspicious of this foreign slave who had risen so quickly in their master's favor. But Joseph's treatment of them had been so consistently fair and generous that their suspicion had gradually given way to genuine affection and loyalty. They knew that under his management, their own lives had become easier and more pleasant. Joseph himself had found a measure of peace in his new role. Though he still grieved for his father and his homeland, he had learned to see the hand of God in his circumstances. The dreams of his youth had not been fulfilled as he had expected, but he was beginning to understand that the Almighty's ways were higher than human ways, and his timing was perfect, even when it seemed mysterious. The house of Potiphar had prospered remarkably under Joseph's stewardship. The crops yielded better harvests, the livestock multiplied, the business ventures proved profitable, and the household ran with an efficiency that was the envy of other noble families. It was as if the blessing of the God of Israel had settled upon the entire estate, bringing prosperity to all who dwelt there. But Joseph's success had not gone unnoticed by everyone in the household, and not all of the attention he received was welcome. Potiphar's wife, a woman of great beauty but questionable character, had begun to take an interest in the handsome young Hebrew who had become so influential in her husband's affairs. Zuleika, for that was her name, was a woman accustomed to getting whatever she desired. Beautiful, wealthy, and powerful, she had never learned to accept denial or frustration. Her marriage to Potiphar had been arranged for political and social reasons, and while she respected her husband, she did not love him with the passion of a devoted wife. As Joseph moved through the household in the course of his duties, Zuleika found herself watching him with growing fascination. There was something about him that set him apart from other men she had known, a combination of strength and gentleness, intelligence and humility that she found irresistibly attractive. He was tall and well-formed, with the kind of natural grace that spoke of noble breeding, and his eyes held a depth of character that spoke of inner strength. At first, Zuleika's interest in Joseph was subtle. A longer glance here, a warmer smile there, questions about his work that seemed to show more than professional concern. Joseph, focused on his duties and innocent of the ways of sophisticated women, initially failed to recognize the nature of her attention. But gradually, as weeks turned to months, Zuleika's behavior became more obvious. She would find excuses to seek him out, to engage him in conversation, to stand closer to him than propriety would dictate. She began to dress more carefully when she knew he would be present, to wear perfumes that would catch his attention, to speak in tones that carried undertones of invitation. Joseph, once he finally understood what was happening, was deeply troubled. He had great respect for Potiphar, who had treated him with kindness and trust, and the thought of betraying that trust in such a fundamental way was abhorrent to him. Moreover, his understanding of God's law and his own moral convictions made it clear that what Zuleika was suggesting was not merely wrong, but sinful in the sight of the Almighty. "My lady," Joseph said one day when Zuleika had been particularly forward in her advances, "I am grateful for your kindness, but I must focus on my duties to your husband. He has trusted me with great responsibilities, and I cannot allow myself to be distracted from them." But Zuleika was not easily discouraged. If anything, Joseph's resistance only seemed to inflame her desire. She began to be more direct in her approaches, more open in her invitations, more persistent in her pursuit. She would corner him in empty rooms, make excuses to touch him, and speak words that left no doubt about her intentions. "Look at me, Joseph," she would say, her voice low and seductive. "I am not some common servant to be dismissed so easily. I am offering you something that few men would refuse. The love of a woman who could make your life far more pleasant than it is now." Joseph found himself walking a dangerous path. He could not openly rebuke his master's wife without risking his position and perhaps his life, but neither could he allow her advances to continue unchecked. He began to arrange his schedule to avoid being alone with her, to keep their interactions brief and purely professional, and to maintain a respectful but distant demeanor in her presence. But Zuleika was a determined woman, and she was not accustomed to being thwarted in her desires. She began to use her position and influence to create situations where Joseph would be forced to interact with her alone. She would summon him to her quarters on pretexts of household business, arrange for other servants to be absent. When she knew he would be present, and use every feminine wile at her disposal to break down his resistance. The situation came to a head on a day when Potiphar had traveled to the capital on business, taking most of the male servants with him. The house was unusually quiet, with only a skeleton staff remaining to maintain the basic operations. Joseph was in the main hall, reviewing the household accounts by the light streaming through the high windows, when Zuleika appeared as if from nowhere. She had dressed herself with particular care that day, wearing a gown of the finest linen that had been dyed the deep blue of lapis lazuli. Gold jewelry adorned her neck and arms, and her dark hair had been arranged in the elaborate style favored by Egyptian noblewomen. Her eyes, outlined with kohl in the Egyptian fashion, seemed to burn with an inner fire as she approached Joseph. "At last," she said, her voice carrying a note of triumph, "we are alone. No servants to interrupt us, no husband to worry about. Just you and me, Joseph, as it should be." Joseph looked up from his scrolls, his heart sinking as he realized the trap that had been laid for him. The other servants were indeed absent, dismissed on various errands that he now realized had been carefully orchestrated. He was alone in the house with his master's wife, and she was making no attempt to hide her intentions. "My lady," Joseph said, rising quickly to his feet, "this is not appropriate. I should return to my quarters until the other servants return." But Zuleika moved to block his path, her eyes never leaving his face. "Why do you continue to resist me, Joseph? What have I done to displease you? Am I not beautiful enough, not powerful enough to deserve your attention?" Joseph took a step back, his mind racing as he tried to find a way out of this dangerous situation without causing offense that might cost him his life. "You are indeed beautiful, my lady, and I am honored by your attention, but I cannot betray the trust that your husband has placed in me." Zuleika laughed, a sound that held more bitterness than joy. "My husband? You speak to me of my husband? He cares more for his accounts and his position at court than he does for me. He would never even know if we found comfort in each other's arms." "But I would know," Joseph replied, his voice firm despite the tremor of fear that ran through him. "And more importantly, God would know. How can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" The mention of Joseph's deity seemed to inflame Zuleika's anger rather than discourage her. "Your God," she said, her voice rising with frustration. "What has your God done for you? He allowed you to be sold into slavery, torn from your family, cast into a foreign land. And yet you still speak of him as if he cares for your welfare?" Joseph's eyes flashed with a passion that surprised even him. "My God has done more for me than I could ever deserve. He has preserved my life, granted me favor in my master's sight, and blessed me even in my bondage. I will not dishonor him by committing this sin, no matter what it might cost me." For a moment, Zuleika was taken aback by the intensity of Joseph's conviction. She had expected him to gradually weaken under her persistent advances, but instead, his resistance seemed to grow stronger with each encounter. The combination of desire and frustration in her heart began to transform into something darker and more dangerous. "You are a fool, Joseph," she said, her voice now carrying an edge of threat. "I am offering you pleasure, advancement, a life of ease and comfort. All you have to do is reach out and take what I am offering. But if you continue to reject me..." The threat hung in the air between them, like a sword ready to fall. Joseph understood perfectly what she was implying. A word from her to Potiphar could result in his punishment, his sale to a harsher master, or even his death. But even faced with such consequences, he could not bring himself to violate his conscience and his faith. "I am sorry to have displeased you, my lady," Joseph said quietly, "but I cannot do what you ask. Now, if you will excuse me, I must see to my duties." He moved toward the door, but Zuleika was not finished with him. In her anger and frustration, she had passed beyond reason into a kind of madness born of wounded pride and ungoverned passion. "You will not leave me like this," she said, reaching out to grab his outer garment. "You will not dismiss me as if I were some common servant. I am the wife of Potiphar, and I will be treated with the respect I deserve." Joseph pulled away from her grasp, but the fine linen of his robe tore in her hands, leaving her holding a piece of the fabric while he fled from the room. He could hear her calling after him, her voice now shrill with rage, but he did not stop until he had reached the safety of the servants' quarters. His heart was pounding as he realized the magnitude of what had just happened. He had preserved his integrity, but at what cost? Zuleika now had physical evidence that could be used to support whatever story she chose to tell her husband. A piece of his clothing in her hands, her word against his. The situation was more perilous than anything he had faced since being thrown into the pit by his brothers. Joseph spent the remainder of the day in prayer and fasting, seeking wisdom from the God of his fathers about what he should do. He considered fleeing, but where could a slave go in a foreign land? He thought about confessing the situation to Potiphar, but would his master believe the word of a Hebrew slave over that of his own wife? As evening approached and the other servants began to return from their errands, Joseph heard the sound of commotion from the main house. Raised voices, hurried footsteps, and the general atmosphere of crisis filled the air. He knew instinctively that Zuleika had begun to implement whatever plan she had devised during the hours since their confrontation. The summons came as he had expected it would. A servant appeared at his door, his face grave with the seriousness of his message. "Joseph, you are commanded to appear before the master immediately. He has returned from his journey and wishes to speak with you." Joseph rose slowly, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what awaited him. He had chosen righteousness over compromise, integrity over safety, and now he would face the consequences of that choice. But even as he walked toward what might be his doom, he felt a strange peace settle over his spirit. He had been tested in the crucible of temptation and had not been found wanting. The God who had sustained him through slavery and exile would sustain him through whatever trial lay ahead. The dreams of his youth might seem further away than ever, but Joseph had learned that the ways of the Almighty were beyond human understanding. As he approached the main hall where Potiphar waited, Joseph lifted his eyes toward heaven and whispered a prayer of trust. Whatever happened next, he would face it with the knowledge that he had remained faithful to his God and to his own conscience. In a world where compromise was easy and integrity was costly, he had chosen the harder path, and that choice would define not only his destiny, but the destiny of nations yet unborn. The confrontation with Potiphar unfolded exactly as Joseph had feared it would. He found his master in the main hall, his face dark with anger and betrayal, while Zuleika stood beside him with tears streaming down her cheeks and the torn piece of Joseph's garment clutched in her hands like evidence of a great crime. "Is this how you repay my trust?" Potiphar demanded, his voice shaking with rage. I have treated you like a son, given you authority over my entire household, and this is how you honor me, by attacking my wife." Joseph opened his mouth to defend himself, but Zuleika's voice cut through the air like a blade before he could speak. "He came to me when the house was empty," she sobbed, her performance so convincing that even Joseph might have believed it if he had not known the truth. "He tried to force himself upon me, and when I cried out, he fled, leaving this piece of his garment in my hands." The evidence seemed overwhelming. Zuleika's tears, the torn fabric, the fact that Joseph had indeed been alone with her in the house, all of it painted a picture of guilt that no protestations of innocence could easily overcome. Joseph looked into his master's eyes and saw not only anger but genuine pain, the hurt of a man who had been betrayed by someone he had trusted completely. "My lord," Joseph said quietly, his voice carrying the dignity that had marked him even in his slavery, "I swear by the God of my fathers that I have done no wrong. I have served you faithfully and would never dishonor your house in such a way." But his words fell on deaf ears. Potiphar was a man of the world, accustomed to the lies and deceptions of those who sought to escape punishment. The evidence before him seemed clear, and his wife's tears appeared genuine. Moreover, the very position of trust that Joseph had held made his alleged crime seem all the more heinous. "You dare to invoke your foreign god in my presence?" Potiphar snarled. "You dare to claim innocence when the evidence of your guilt is before my very eyes." Joseph felt the walls of his world collapsing around him once again. Just as his brother's jealousy had destroyed his place in his father's house, so now false accusation was destroying the life he had built in Egypt. The irony was cruel. His very righteousness had become the instrument of his downfall. Potiphar's anger was terrible to behold, but Joseph could see something else behind it, a flicker of doubt, perhaps even a suspicion that he was not hearing the whole truth. The captain of Pharaoh's guard had not reached his position without developing an ability to read men's characters, and in his heart he knew that Joseph was not capable of the crime of which he was accused. But Potiphar was also a man trapped by circumstances. His wife had made a public accusation, and to doubt her word would bring shame upon his house and cast suspicion upon his own ability to control his household. Whatever private doubts he might have, he had no choice but to act upon the evidence as it had been presented to him. "The penalty for what you have done is death," Potiphar said, his voice now cold and formal. "By law, I have the right to execute you immediately." Joseph closed his eyes and prepared himself for the final blow. He had faced death before, in the pit where his brothers had thrown him, and he was not afraid to face it again. But to his surprise, Potiphar continued speaking. "However," the captain said slowly, "I will show mercy. Instead of death, you will be imprisoned in the king's prison, where you will remain for the rest of your life. Guards, take him away." The soldiers who had been standing at the edges of the hall moved forward to seize Joseph. As they bound his hands with chains, he looked one last time at the man who had been his master and benefactor. In Potiphar's eyes, he saw a complex mixture of anger, disappointment, and something that might have been regret. "My lord," Joseph said as the guards prepared to lead him away, "I pray that someday you will know the truth of what happened here today." Potiphar turned away without responding, but Joseph caught a glimpse of uncertainty in his expression. The captain was a just man at heart, and the doubts that he could not publicly acknowledge would gnaw at him in the private hours of the night. The king's prison was located in a massive stone fortress on the outskirts of Memphis, its walls rising like cliffs from the desert floor. As Joseph was led through its gates, he felt the weight of despair settling upon his shoulders like a burial shroud. He had survived slavery, only to fall into an even deeper pit of hopelessness. The interior of the prison was a maze of narrow corridors and cramped cells, filled with the sound of clanking chains and the groans of men who had lost all hope. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and human misery, and the darkness was broken only by the occasional torch that cast dancing shadows on the stone walls. Joseph was thrown into a cell that he would share with several other prisoners, men whose crimes ranged from theft to sedition to murder. The cell was barely large enough for them all to lie down, and the only light came from a small window high up near the ceiling. It was here, in this place of darkness and despair, that Joseph would spend the next phase of his journey. At first, the adjustment to prison life was almost unbearable. The food was barely edible, the sleeping arrangements were uncomfortable, and the constant presence of dangerous criminals made every moment a potential threat. Joseph found himself longing for the relative comfort of his slavery in Potiphar's house, where at least he had been treated with some measure of respect and dignity. But gradually, as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, Joseph began to adapt to his new circumstances. The same character traits that had served him well in Potiphar's house, his integrity, his intelligence, and his natural leadership ability, began to manifest themselves even in prison. The keeper of the prison, a gruff but fair-minded Egyptian named Katie, soon noticed that Joseph was different from the other prisoners. He carried himself with dignity despite his circumstances, treated his fellow inmates with kindness, and seemed to possess an unusual wisdom in dealing with difficult situations. "You are not like the others," Katie observed one day as he made his rounds through the prison. "There is something about you that sets you apart." Joseph looked up from the simple task he had been assigned, mending torn garments for the other prisoners. "I serve the God of heaven," he said simply. "He has not abandoned me, even in this place." Katie was intrigued by this response. He had seen many prisoners claim the protection of various gods, but few of them demonstrated the kind of peace and strength that Joseph displayed. Over time, he began to give Joseph small responsibilities within the prison, and was amazed at how efficiently and honestly the young Hebrew handled them. Before long, Joseph had become an unofficial leader among the prisoners. Men brought their disputes to him for resolution, sought his advice on personal matters, and looked to him for comfort in their darkest hours. Even the most hardened criminals seemed to soften in his presence, influenced by his example of dignity and hope in the midst of despair. The keeper of the prison, observing this transformation, began to entrust Joseph with greater responsibilities. Soon, he was essentially running the day-to-day operations of the prison, managing the work details, supervising the distribution of food, and maintaining order among the inmates. "The Lord was with Joseph and extended kindness to him," the prison keeper often remarked to his subordinates. "Everything he does prospers, as if his God blesses all his endeavors." Indeed, under Joseph's informal leadership, the prison ran more smoothly than it ever had before. Disputes among the prisoners became less frequent, work was completed more efficiently, and the general atmosphere of the place improved dramatically. It was as if the presence of this one righteous man had brought a measure of peace to a place that had known only violence and despair. But Joseph's circumstances were still desperate. He was a prisoner with no hope of release, no prospect of freedom, no connection to the outside world that might offer him rescue. The dreams of his youth seemed not just unfulfilled, but impossible. How could a man who was locked away in prison ever rise to a position where his own brothers would bow down to him? Yet Joseph continued to trust in the God of his fathers. In the quiet hours of the night, when the prison was still except for the snores and groans of sleeping men, he would pray and meditate on the goodness of the Almighty. He had learned that God's ways were mysterious, that his timing was perfect, and that even the darkest circumstances could serve his ultimate purposes. The other prisoners began to notice something else about Joseph: his ability to interpret dreams. Just as God had spoken to him through visions in his youth, so now he seemed to speak through Joseph to others who were troubled by mysterious nocturnal revelations. When a fellow prisoner would wake from a disturbing dream, he would often seek out Joseph for an explanation, and Joseph, guided by divine wisdom, would provide interpretations that consistently proved accurate. Word of this gift began to spread throughout the prison, and even the guards would sometimes quietly ask Joseph to explain their dreams. But it was the arrival of two particular prisoners that would mark the beginning of a new chapter in Joseph's story. These were no ordinary criminals, but men who had held positions of great importance in Pharaoh's court before their fall from grace. Their presence in the prison would set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately lead to Joseph's deliverance, though he could not know it at the time. As Joseph lay on his hard bed in the darkness of his cell, listening to the sounds of the sleeping prison around him, he wondered what purpose God might have for him in this place of despair. He could not see the future that awaited him, could not imagine the great role he would play in the salvation of nations, but he held fast to his faith in the God who had never abandoned him. The dreams of his youth might seem impossible now, but Joseph had learned that with God, all things were possible. Even in the depths of prison, even in the darkest hour of his journey, the hand of the Almighty was still guiding his steps toward a destiny that would astonish the world. 2 years had passed since Joseph's imprisonment, and he had settled into the rhythm of life within the stone walls that had become his world. The prison, under his informal guidance, had transformed from a place of chaos and despair into something resembling a functioning community. The keeper, Katie, had come to rely so completely on Joseph's wisdom and integrity that he barely concerned himself with the daily operations of the facility. But Joseph's heart still carried the weight of his circumstances. The false accusation that had landed him in this place burned within him like a constant fire, not because of bitterness, for he had learned to forgive even Zuleika's treachery, but because of the seeming impossibility of ever proving his innocence. He was a Hebrew slave in an Egyptian prison, forgotten by the world above, and seemingly abandoned to spend his remaining years in darkness. It was on a morning when the heat of summer was beginning to build that Joseph noticed something unusual in the demeanor of two of his fellow prisoners. These were not common criminals, but men who had once moved in the highest circles of Egyptian society. One was the chief cupbearer to Pharaoh himself, the man responsible for serving wine to the god-king of Egypt. The other was the chief baker, whose elaborate creations had graced the royal table and delighted the pharaoh's court. Both men had fallen from grace simultaneously, accused of some offense against Pharaoh that had landed them in the king's prison. The exact nature of their crime was unclear. Palace intrigue was often shrouded in mystery and suspicion, but their presence in the prison was a constant reminder that even the highest positions offered no security against the capricious nature of royal favor. Joseph had come to know both men during their imprisonment. The cupbearer, whose name was Asaph, was a nervous, anxious man who constantly worried about his future and spent his days lamenting his fall from grace. The baker, Wasit, was more philosophical about his circumstances, but no less concerned about what fate awaited him. On this particular morning, both men appeared even more troubled than usual. They sat in the corner of the common area where the prisoners gathered for their meager breakfast, their faces marked by an expression of confusion and distress that caught Joseph's attention immediately. "My friends," Joseph said, approaching them with the gentle manner that had endeared him to so many of his fellow inmates, "I see that you are troubled this morning. What weighs upon your hearts?" Asaph looked up at Joseph with eyes that were red from lack of sleep. "We have both had dreams," he said quietly. "Strange and vivid dreams that have left us greatly disturbed, but there is no one here who can interpret them for us." In the world of ancient Egypt, dreams were considered messages from the gods, windows into the future that required skilled interpretation to be understood. The royal court employed professional dream interpreters, men learned in the sacred arts who could divine the meaning of nocturnal visions. But in prison, such luxuries were unavailable, leaving the two former court officials frustrated and afraid. Joseph felt a familiar stirring in his spirit, the same sense of divine presence that had accompanied him since his youth. He remembered his own dreams, the visions that had seemed so clear in their meaning, yet had led to such unexpected consequences. More importantly, he remembered the gift that God had given him for understanding the dreams of others, a gift that had already served him well among his fellow prisoners. "Do not interpretations belong to God?" Joseph said, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of one who had learned to trust in divine wisdom. "Please, tell me your dreams." The cupbearer glanced around nervously, as if afraid that speaking of his dream might somehow make it more real or more threatening. But something in Joseph's manner inspired confidence, and he found himself unable to resist the invitation to share what had troubled him so deeply. "In my dream," Asaph began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I saw a vine before me. The vine had 3 branches, and as I watched, it budded and blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into the cup, and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand." Joseph listened intently, his mind already working to understand the symbolic language in which God often spoke through dreams. The vision was remarkably clear in its imagery, and as the cupbearer finished his account, Joseph felt the interpretation forming in his consciousness like words written by an invisible hand. "This is the interpretation," Joseph said, his voice filled with the authority of divine revelation. "The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position. You will once again place Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer." The cupbearer's face lit up with hope and joy at these words. The interpretation made perfect sense. The vine represented his connection to Pharaoh, the 3 branches represented the time remaining until his restoration, and the act of serving wine represented his return to royal favor. But Joseph was not finished speaking. As Asaph celebrated the good news he had received, Joseph's expression grew more serious, and he reached out to place a hand on the man's shoulder. "But remember me when it goes well with you," Joseph said earnestly. "Please do me the kindness to mention me to Pharaoh, and get me out of this house. For I was stolen from the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that they should put me into the pit." The cupbearer nodded eagerly, his heart full of gratitude for the hope that Joseph had given him. "I will remember," he promised solemnly. "When I am restored to my position, I will speak to Pharaoh about your case. You have my word." Khaemwaset, the chief baker, had been listening to this exchange with growing excitement. If Joseph could interpret the cupbearer's dream so convincingly, perhaps he could also provide insight into the vision that had troubled his own sleep. "I also had a dream," the baker said, his voice filled with anticipation. "In my dream, there were 3 baskets of white bread on my head. In the uppermost basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head." Joseph's heart grew heavy as he considered this second dream. The symbolism was as clear as it had been in the cupbearer's vision, but the message was far different. He looked into the baker's hopeful eyes and felt the weight of having to deliver news that would crush the man's spirit. For a long moment, Joseph struggled with whether to speak the truth or to offer false comfort. But his commitment to honesty and his understanding of the sacred nature of dream interpretation compelled him to deliver the message that God had given him, however painful it might be. "This is the interpretation," Joseph said softly, his voice filled with compassion for the man who awaited his words. "The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat your flesh from you." The words fell upon the baker like stones, crushing his hopes and filling him with despair. He stared at Joseph in shock, unable to believe that his dream could carry such a terrible message. But something in Joseph's manner, the same quiet authority that had marked his interpretation of the cupbearer's vision, convinced him that the young Hebrew was speaking the truth. For the next 3 days, the prison was filled with tension as the inmates waited to see if Joseph's interpretations would prove accurate. The cupbearer alternated between hope and anxiety, while the baker retreated into sullen silence, preparing himself for the fate that had been prophesied. On the 3rd day, word came from the palace that sent ripples of excitement and fear throughout the prison. It was Pharaoh's birthday, and in honor of the occasion, he was reviewing the cases of various prisoners and officials who had fallen from grace. Some would be restored to favor, others would face final judgment. The summons came exactly as Joseph had predicted. Both the cupbearer and the baker were called from their cells and taken under heavy guard to appear before Pharaoh himself. The entire prison held its breath as they waited to learn the fate of the 2 men. By evening, the news had returned to the prison. The cupbearer had indeed been restored to his position, lifted up, and returned to royal favor just as Joseph had foretold. But the baker had been executed, hung on a tree exactly as the dream had indicated, his body left for the birds to devour. The accuracy of Joseph's interpretations sent a shiver of awe and fear through the prison population. Here was a man who could truly speak with the voice of God, who could see into the future with the clarity of divine revelation. Even the guards and prison officials looked at Joseph with new respect, recognizing that they were in the presence of someone truly extraordinary. But for Joseph himself, the fulfillment of his prophecies brought a mixture of satisfaction and deep disappointment. He had been correct about the cupbearer's restoration, which meant that his pathway to freedom was now open. Asaph had promised to remember him to Pharaoh, to speak of his unjust imprisonment and request his release. Days passed, then weeks, then months. Joseph waited patiently for word from the cupbearer, confident that the man would honor his promise and secure his freedom. But as time went on without any sign of intervention from the palace, Joseph began to realize a painful truth. The cupbearer had forgotten him. In the joy of his restoration to royal favor, in the relief of escaping death and returning to his position of privilege, Asaph had simply put the Hebrew prisoner out of his mind. Joseph had become a memory from a dark chapter of his life that he preferred not to revisit. The disappointment was crushing. Joseph had seen his gift from God vindicated in the most dramatic way possible, yet it had not brought him the freedom he so desperately sought. Once again, he found himself abandoned by those he had helped, forgotten by those who owed him their gratitude. But Joseph did not allow bitterness to take root in his heart. He had learned too much about the mysterious ways of God to assume that this setback was the end of his story. The Almighty, who had sustained him through slavery and false accusation, would sustain him through this disappointment as well. In the quiet hours of the night, as he lay in his cell listening to the breathing of his fellow prisoners, Joseph continued to pray and to trust. He did not know that his moment of deliverance was still approaching, that the dreams which would change his life forever were already stirring in the mind of Pharaoh himself. The God who had spoken to him through visions in his youth, who had given him the gift of interpreting the dreams of others, was preparing to use that same gift to elevate him to heights he could never have imagined. But first, Joseph would have to endure 2 more years of waiting, 2 more years of faithful service in the darkness, before the dawn of his destiny would finally break. 2 years had crept by since the cupbearer's restoration, 2 years during which Joseph had faithfully continued his duties in the prison while nursing the hope that his situation might change. The disappointment of being forgotten by Asaph had been sharp, but Joseph had learned to find peace in serving others and trusting in God's timing, even when that timing seemed impossibly slow. The prison had become more than just his place of confinement. It had become his ministry. Men came to him not just with dreams to interpret, but with troubles of the heart, disputes to resolve, and burdens to share. Under his influence, the atmosphere of the place had been transformed from one of despair to something approaching hope. Even in chains, Joseph had found a way to bring light into darkness. But in the palace of Memphis, far from the stone walls that contained Joseph, events were stirring that would soon change the course of his life forever. Pharaoh Amenemheb, the god-king of Egypt, who ruled over the mightiest empire on earth, had been troubled by dreams of such vividness and strange content that they had robbed him of sleep and filled his heart with foreboding. The first dream had come to him on a night when the Nile was at its lowest ebb, just before the season when the annual flood should begin to restore life to the land. In his vision, Pharaoh found himself standing by the great river, watching its waters flow past the reeds and papyrus that lined its banks. As he stood there in his dream, 7 cows emerged from the river, magnificent beasts, fat and sleek, their hides gleaming in the sunlight. They were the finest cattle he had ever seen, symbols of abundance and prosperity. The cows came up from the water and began to graze in the lush grass along the riverbank, their contentment and health a beautiful sight to behold. But then, as Pharaoh continued to watch, 7 more cows emerged from the Nile. These were horrible to look upon, gaunt and bony, their ribs showing through their skin, their eyes hollow with hunger. They were the worst cattle Pharaoh had ever seen, so thin and wasted that they could barely stand. What happened next filled the Pharaoh with horror. The 7 lean cows approached the 7 fat cows and devoured them completely, consuming their flesh until nothing remained. But despite having eaten the fat cows, the lean cattle appeared no better fed than before. They remained as gaunt and horrible as they had been when they first emerged from the river. Pharaoh awoke from this dream with his heart pounding and his body covered in sweat. The vision had been so vivid, so real, that he could still smell the muddy banks of the Nile and hear the lowing of the cattle. But more than its vividness, the dream carried with it a sense of ominous significance that he could not shake. The Pharaoh tried to dismiss the vision as a product of an uneasy stomach or the pressures of ruling an empire, but sleep would not return to him. Finally, as dawn began to break over the palace, exhaustion overtook him and he fell into a fitful slumber. Almost immediately, a second dream came to him, different in its imagery, but similar in its disturbing nature. This time, he saw himself in one of the great grain fields of the Nile Delta, standing among the golden stalks that represented Egypt's agricultural wealth. Before him grew a single stalk of grain, but it was unlike any he had ever seen. 7 ears of corn grew from this one stalk, and each ear was perfect, full, ripe, and healthy, representing the best that Egyptian agriculture could produce. The grain seemed to glow with golden light, promising abundance and prosperity for the land. But then, from the same stalk, 7 more ears of grain appeared. These were thin and withered, blasted by the hot east wind that sometimes brought drought and famine to the land. They were pitiful to look upon, representing crop failure and hunger. As Pharaoh watched in horror, the 7 thin ears of grain swallowed up the 7 good ears, consuming them completely until nothing remained of the abundance that had first appeared. And like the lean cows in his first dream, the thin ears showed no improvement from their consumption of the good grain. Pharaoh awoke for the second time that night, this time with a cry of distress that brought his guards running to his chamber. The king of Egypt, the most powerful man in the world, sat on his bed, trembling like a child, overwhelmed by visions he could not understand, but knew were of vital importance. "Send for the magicians," Pharaoh commanded, as soon as he had composed himself. "Send for all the wise men of Egypt. I must know the meaning of these dreams." By the time the sun was fully risen, the throne room of the palace was filled with the most learned men in the kingdom. Magicians, sorcerers, wise men, and interpreters of dreams, all the experts in supernatural knowledge that Egypt could produce, had been hastily summoned to hear their pharaoh's visions and provide their interpretation. The assembled wise men listened intently as Pharaoh recounted his dreams in vivid detail. They asked questions about specific elements of the visions, consulted their scrolls and sacred texts, and huddled together in whispered conferences. But despite all their learning and supposed expertise, none of them could provide a satisfactory interpretation of the pharaoh's dreams. Some suggested that the dreams were merely the product of physical discomfort and had no prophetic significance. Others offered interpretations so vague and contradictory that they only added to Pharaoh's confusion. Still, others admitted frankly that the dreams were beyond their ability to understand, despite their reputation for wisdom. As the day wore on and expert after expert failed to provide insight into his visions, Pharaoh's frustration grew. These were the men upon whom he relied for guidance in supernatural matters, yet when faced with dreams that clearly carried important meaning, they were utterly useless. It was then, as the pharaoh sat on his throne contemplating the failure of his wise men, that the cupbearer Asaph suddenly stepped forward. The man's face was pale with a mixture of embarrassment and excitement, as if he had just remembered something of vital importance. "Today I remember my offenses," Asaph said, falling to his knees before the throne. "When Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me and the chief baker in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, we both had dreams in the same night, each man according to the interpretation of his dream." Pharaoh leaned forward on his throne, intrigued by this unexpected development. He remembered the cupbearer's imprisonment and subsequent restoration, but had not heard details about what had transpired during his time in prison. "Continue," Pharaoh commanded, his voice carrying the authority of one accustomed to immediate obedience. "A young Hebrew was there with us," Asaph continued, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "A servant of the captain of the guard. We told him our dreams, and he interpreted them for us, giving each man the interpretation of his dream. And it came to pass, just as he interpreted for us. I was restored to my office, and the baker was hanged." The throne room fell silent as the implications of the cupbearer's words sank in. Here was someone who had demonstrated the ability to interpret dreams with perfect accuracy, yet he remained forgotten in prison while the wisest men in Egypt stood helpless before Pharaoh's visions. Pharaoh felt a surge of hope and anticipation. "Send for this Hebrew immediately," he commanded, his voice ringing with royal authority. "Bring him before me without delay." The guards who received this command were already familiar with Joseph's reputation, for word of his wisdom and integrity had spread even beyond the prison walls. They hurried to the prison with the pharaoh's orders, their hearts racing with the magnitude of their mission. When they arrived at the prison, they found Joseph in the common area, settling a dispute between 2 inmates with the patient wisdom that had made him beloved among the prisoners. The sight of the royal guards caused a stir of excitement and fear throughout the facility, for their presence could only mean that someone was about to face either elevation or execution. "The Hebrew Joseph," the lead guard announced, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "By command of Pharaoh, you are to appear before His Majesty immediately." Joseph felt his heart leap with a mixture of hope and trepidation. After so many years of imprisonment, after the crushing disappointment of being forgotten by the cupbearer, he had almost given up hope of ever seeing freedom again. But now, suddenly, he was being summoned to appear before the most powerful man on earth. The prison keeper, Katie, appeared at Joseph's side with a mixture of joy and sadness in his eyes. "My friend," he said quietly, "this may be your deliverance, but know that you will be greatly missed here. You have brought light to this dark place." Joseph was quickly taken to be cleaned and properly dressed for his appearance before Pharaoh. His prison garments were removed, and he was bathed and shaved according to Egyptian custom. Fresh clothing was provided, not the fine linen of nobility, but clean, respectable garments suitable for appearing in the royal presence. As Joseph was prepared for his audience with Pharaoh, his mind raced with possibilities. Why was he being summoned? Was this related to his interpretation of the cupbearer's dream? Had some new accusation been made against him? Or could this possibly be the deliverance he had prayed for during so many long nights in his cell? The journey from the prison to the palace was like traveling from one world to another. Joseph had not seen the outside world for years, and the sights and sounds of Memphis overwhelmed his senses. The bustling streets, the magnificent buildings, the crowds of people going about their daily business, all of it seemed almost unreal after the confined world of the prison. But it was the palace itself that truly took Joseph's breath away. The massive structure rose from the heart of the city like a man-made mountain, its walls adorned with colorful paintings and hieroglyphs that told the stories of Egypt's glorious past. Guards in elaborate armor stood at every entrance, and the very air seemed to vibrate with power and authority. As Joseph was led through the corridors of the palace, he marveled at the luxury that surrounded him. Precious stones gleamed from the walls, statues of gods and pharaohs lined the hallways, and everywhere he looked, there were signs of wealth and power beyond imagination. Yet despite the magnificence that surrounded him, Joseph's heart remained focused on the God of his fathers, the one who had sustained him through every trial. Finally, they arrived at the great throne room, where Pharaoh Amenemhib sat upon a throne of gold and ivory, wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. The room was filled with courtiers, officials, and the wise men who had failed to interpret the royal dreams. All eyes turned to Joseph as he was led forward, this Hebrew prisoner who had been summoned to attempt what Egypt's greatest minds could not accomplish. Joseph approached the throne with dignity, but without arrogance, remembering that he was still technically a prisoner appearing before his ultimate earthly judge. He had learned much about Egyptian court protocol during his time in Potiphar's house, and he conducted himself with the proper respect while maintaining the quiet confidence that had marked him throughout his trials. "Are you the Hebrew who can interpret dreams?" Pharaoh asked, his voice carrying both authority and desperate hope. Joseph's response would prove to be one of the most important speeches of his life, for it would not only demonstrate his wisdom, but also proclaim his faith before the most powerful court on earth. "It is not in me," Joseph replied, his voice clear and strong. "God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace." The words rang through the throne room like a declaration of faith. Here was a man who, even when faced with the opportunity to claim credit for supernatural abilities, chose instead to give glory to the God of Israel. The assembled courtiers murmured among themselves, impressed by both the humility and the confidence of this young Hebrew. Pharaoh studied Joseph carefully, seeing in him something that had been lacking in all his wise men, a genuine connection to divine power, not merely human learning and pretension. The king felt a stirring of hope that had been absent since his dreams had first troubled his sleep. "Then hear my dreams," Pharaoh said, leaning forward on his throne, "and tell me what God would have me know." As Pharaoh began to recount his visions of the 7 fat and 7 lean cows, then the 7 good and 7 withered ears of grain, Joseph listened with the intense concentration of one who knew that his life, and perhaps the fate of nations, hung in the balance. But more than that, he listened with the spiritual sensitivity of one who had learned to hear the voice of God in the most unlikely circumstances. The interpretation began to form in Joseph's mind with the same clarity that had marked his understanding of the cupbearers' and bakers' dreams. But this vision was far greater in scope and importance than those personal prophecies. This was a message that would affect the destiny of the greatest empire on earth, and through it, the survival of the chosen people of God. As Joseph prepared to speak the words that would change his life forever, he silently lifted his heart in prayer to the God who had sustained him through slavery, false accusation, and years of imprisonment. The moment of his greatest trial and his greatest opportunity had arrived, and he was ready to serve as the instrument through which divine wisdom would be revealed to the world. The dreams of Pharaoh were about to be unlocked, and with them, the next chapter in the remarkable story of God's providence would begin to unfold. Joseph, the dreamer who had been sold into slavery by his own brothers, was about to become the interpreter of dreams for the mightiest king on earth. The great throne room of Pharaoh fell silent as Joseph prepared to speak the interpretation that God had revealed to him. Every eye was fixed upon this Hebrew prisoner who claimed that his God would provide the answer that Egypt's wisest men could not give. The very air seemed to vibrate with tension and anticipation. Joseph took a deep breath and began to speak, his voice carrying the authority of divine revelation. "The dreams of Pharaoh are one," he declared, his words echoing through the vast chamber. "God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dreams are one. The 7 lean and ugly cows which came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 empty ears blighted by the east wind are 7 years of famine." A murmur ran through the assembled courtiers as they began to grasp the magnitude of what Joseph was revealing. This was not merely a personal prophecy, but a vision that would affect the entire kingdom of Egypt and all the nations that depended upon her grain. Joseph continued, his voice growing stronger as he delivered the message that God had given him. "This is what I have spoken to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. Indeed, 7 years of great plenty will come throughout all the land of Egypt. But after them 7 years of famine will arise, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine will deplete the land." The implication of these words sent a chill through the throne room. Egypt was the granary of the ancient world, the land whose abundant harvests fed not only its own people, but the surrounding nations as well. The thought of 7 years of famine in such a place was almost unthinkable. "So, the plenty will not be known in the land because of the famine following," Joseph went on, "for it will be very severe." And the dream was repeated to Pharaoh twice, because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. Pharaoh leaned back on his throne, his mind reeling with the implications of what he had heard. The interpretation rang true in his heart with a clarity that none of the explanations offered by his wise men had possessed. This was indeed the voice of divine revelation, spoken through a man who had demonstrated supernatural insight. But Joseph was not finished. Having delivered the interpretation of the dreams, he now prepared to offer counsel that would prove his wisdom extended beyond mere revelation to practical planning and administration. "Now therefore," Joseph said, his voice taking on the tone of a trusted advisor, "let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint officers over the land, to collect 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt in the 7 plentiful years." The boldness of what Joseph was proposing was breathtaking. He was suggesting that Pharaoh implement a massive economic program that would fundamentally alter the way Egypt managed its agricultural resources. Such a plan would require unprecedented organization, storage capacity, and administrative oversight. "And let them gather all the food of those good years that are coming," Joseph continued, "and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh, and let them keep food in the cities. Then that food shall be as a reserve for the land for the 7 years of famine which shall be in the land of Egypt, that the land may not perish during the famine." The throne room was utterly silent as the full scope of Joseph's proposal sank in. He was outlining a plan that would not only save Egypt from the coming famine, but position the kingdom to help other nations that would inevitably suffer during the years of scarcity. It was a vision of both survival and unprecedented power. Pharaoh sat in contemplation for several long moments, weighing the words he had heard. The interpretation of his dreams felt true in his spirit, confirmed by an inner certainty that this Hebrew was indeed speaking for his God. But more than that, the practical wisdom of the proposed solution impressed him deeply. "The advice is good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all his servants," the king finally announced, his voice carrying throughout the chamber. But then he asked the question that would determine Joseph's fate. "Can we find such a one as this, a man in whom is the Spirit of God?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Here was Pharaoh, acknowledging that what was needed was not merely administrative skill, but divine wisdom and supernatural insight. Where could such a man be found? Pharaoh's eyes moved slowly around the room, taking in the faces of his courtiers and advisors. These were capable men, skilled in the arts of government and administration. But none of them had demonstrated the kind of divine connection that would be necessary for the monumental task ahead. Finally, his gaze settled once again on Joseph, and a look of revelation crossed his face. "Inasmuch as God has shown you all this," Pharaoh said, his voice growing stronger with conviction, "there is no one as discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall be ruled according to your word. Only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you." The words that followed would echo through history as one of the most dramatic reversals of fortune ever recorded. "See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt," Pharaoh declared, rising from his throne to emphasize the magnitude of his decision. With ceremonial gravity, Pharaoh removed his signet ring from his hand and placed it on Joseph's finger, investing him with the authority to act in the king's name. He clothed Joseph with garments of fine linen, the dress of Egyptian nobility, and put a gold chain around his neck as a symbol of his elevated status. But the most dramatic moment came when Pharaoh commanded that Joseph ride in the second chariot, the vehicle reserved for the highest official in the kingdom after Pharaoh himself. As Joseph rode through the streets of Memphis, heralds ran before him crying, "Bow the knee," in Egyptian, announcing to all that this former Hebrew slave now held authority over the entire land. "I am Pharaoh," the king proclaimed in the final act of Joseph's elevation, "and without your consent, no man may lift his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt." Pharaoh also gave Joseph an Egyptian name, Zaphnath-Paaneah, meaning God speaks, he lives, and arranged for him to marry Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, priest of On. This marriage would not only provide Joseph with a wife, but would also integrate him fully into Egyptian society and give him the social standing necessary to carry out his responsibilities. As Joseph stood in the palace that evening, clothed in fine linen and wearing the signet ring of Pharaoh, he could hardly believe the transformation that had taken place. That morning, he had been a forgotten prisoner, condemned to spend his life in chains. Now, he was the second most powerful man in Egypt, invested with authority over the mightiest empire on earth. But Joseph's heart was not lifted up with pride at his elevation. Instead, he was filled with awe at the mysterious ways of God. Every trial he had endured, his brother's betrayal, his slavery in Potiphar's house, his false imprisonment, had been preparing him for this moment. The dreams of his youth, which had seemed so impossible during his darkest hours, were beginning to find their fulfillment in ways he could never have imagined. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, the same age at which priests in Israel began their ministry. The symbolism was not lost on him. He was indeed entering a kind of priesthood, serving as God's instrument for the preservation of nations during the coming crisis. As he began his work of preparing Egypt for the 7 years of plenty and the 7 years of famine that would follow, Joseph threw himself into the task with all the energy and wisdom that God had given him. He traveled throughout the land, establishing storage facilities, organizing the collection of grain, and creating an administrative system capable of handling the greatest logistical challenge in Egypt's history. During the 7 years of abundance that followed, the land produced bumper crops just as the dreams had foretold. Under Joseph's direction, 1/5 of all the grain was collected and stored in massive granaries built in every major city. The storage program was so successful that they stopped measuring the grain because it was beyond number, like the sand of the sea. During this time, Joseph's personal life was also blessed. Asenath bore him 2 sons, whom he named according to his understanding of God's work in his life. The firstborn he called Manasseh, saying, "God has made me forget all my toil and all my father's house." The second he named Ephraim, saying, "God has caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction." But even as Joseph established himself as the savior of Egypt and built a new life for himself, he never forgot his origins or the family he had left behind in Canaan. In quiet moments, he would remember his father Jacob and wonder if the old patriarch still lived. He thought often of his brothers, and though the pain of their betrayal had healed, he wondered what had become of them. He could not know that the God who had elevated him to power in Egypt was preparing to use him for an even greater purpose: the preservation of the very family that had rejected him. The dreams of his youth, in which his brothers had bowed down to him, were about to be fulfilled in a way that would bring not vengeance, but redemption. The 7 years of plenty passed like a dream, and then, exactly as Joseph had prophesied, the famine began. It started gradually, with reduced rainfall and poorer harvests, but soon developed into a crisis that affected not only Egypt, but all the surrounding lands. Nations that had once been self-sufficient found themselves desperate for grain, and their representatives began the long journey to Egypt, where they had heard that food was still available. As Joseph stood in the great administrative complex he had built to manage the distribution of grain, watching the endless lines of people who had come seeking food, he knew that his greatest test was yet to come. Somewhere among those who would come seeking bread were 10 brothers who had once sold him into slavery. The moment of ultimate reconciliation was approaching, and with it, the fulfillment of God's eternal purposes for the chosen people. The dreamer had become the dream's fulfillment, and the story of redemption was about to reach its climax. The famine that Joseph had prophesied spread across the ancient world like a plague, withering crops and emptying granaries from Mesopotamia to the shores of the Mediterranean. What had begun as poor harvests in the second year after the abundance ended had developed into a crisis of starvation that threatened entire civilizations. Only Egypt, under Joseph's wise administration, had adequate stores of grain to sustain its people and sell to desperate foreign buyers. In the land of Canaan, the famine struck with particular severity. The hills and valleys that had once been green with growing grain now lay brown and barren under the relentless sun. The flocks that had once been Jacob's pride grew thin and weak, and many died for lack of adequate pasture. The old patriarch, now bearing the full weight of his years, watched his family's resources dwindle and knew that something must be done, or they would all perish. "Why do you look at one another?" Jacob asked his sons one day as they sat in the entrance of his tent, their faces gaunt with hunger and marked by the helplessness of men who had run out of options. "Indeed, I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down to that place and buy some for us, that we may live and not die." The 10 brothers, for Benjamin, the youngest, remained at home with his father, exchanged glances that carried the weight of shared guilt and unspoken memories. Egypt, the land where they had sold their brother into slavery so many years ago. The thought of returning to that place awakened feelings they had tried to bury, reminders of a sin that time had never fully erased from their consciences. But hunger is a powerful motivator, and the alternative to going to Egypt was starvation. With heavy hearts but determined spirits, the 10 sons of Jacob prepared for the journey that would take them back to the scene of their greatest crime, though they could not know that it would also become the place of their redemption. Reuben, now the acknowledged leader of his brothers since their father's advancing age, organized the expedition with the same careful attention to detail that had once marked his shepherding. They gathered what silver they had left, prepared their donkeys for the long journey, and said their farewells to the family members who would remain behind. Jacob's blessing upon his departing sons was mingled with tears and anxiety. "May God Almighty give you mercy before the man," he prayed, referring to the Egyptian official they would have to deal with to purchase grain. "And may he send your other brother back with you." The old patriarch's words were more prophetic than he knew. The other brother he spoke of, meaning Benjamin, whom he refused to send on the dangerous journey, would indeed return with them, but so would another brother, whose return would be beyond his wildest dreams. The journey to Egypt took many days, and as the brothers traveled the familiar trade routes that connected Canaan with the Nile Delta, they had ample time to think about the last time they had made this journey. Then, they had been following the Ishmaelite caravan that carried their brother into slavery. Now they were making the trip themselves, driven by desperation and need. "Do you think he is still alive?" Simeon asked one evening as they camped beneath the stars that had once looked down upon their crime. It was the first time any of them had spoken directly about Joseph during the entire journey, though all of them had been thinking about him. "If he survived the first years," Judah replied quietly, "he might still live. Slaves who prove useful to their masters can sometimes prosper in Egypt." "Or he might have died long ago," Levi said, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been regret. "We will never know." But they would know sooner than they could possibly imagine. The God who had preserved Joseph through every trial had also been preparing his brothers for this moment of reunion, using their own suffering and need to bring them back to the brother they had wronged. When the brothers finally reached the borders of Egypt, they were amazed by what they saw. While the rest of the world was struggling with famine, Egypt appeared to be thriving. The great irrigation systems that channeled the waters of the Nile continued to function, and though the harvest had indeed failed, massive granaries throughout the land were distributing stored grain to keep the population fed. The organization and efficiency of the relief effort was unlike anything they had ever seen. long lines of people from many nations waited patiently for their turn to purchase grain, while Egyptian officials managed the distribution with systematic precision. Clearly, this was a land under wise and capable leadership. The brothers joined the queue of foreign buyers and waited their turn to appear before the officials who controlled the grain distribution. They had no idea that the man they would ultimately face was the same brother they had sold into slavery 22 years earlier, or that their every move was being watched by eyes that knew them better than they knew themselves. Joseph had been overseeing the grain distribution personally, partly out of administrative necessity, but also because he found in the work a sense of purpose that connected him to his divine calling. As he moved through the vast complex of storehouses and administrative buildings, checking records and supervising the complex logistics of feeding a nation and its foreign customers, he was the picture of a man who had found his destiny. But on this particular day, as Joseph reviewed a list of foreign delegations that had come seeking grain, his attention was caught by a report from one of his subordinates. A group of 10 men from Canaan had arrived, claiming to be brothers and sons of a man named Jacob. They sought to purchase grain for their family, which was suffering from the famine that had struck their homeland. Joseph's heart began to race as he read the report. Could it be? After all these years, had his brothers finally come to Egypt? He gave orders that this particular group be brought directly to him, claiming that their request required special attention from the highest authority. When the 10 brothers were ushered into Joseph's presence, they found themselves face to face with a man whose appearance and bearing proclaimed him to be one of the most powerful officials in Egypt. He was dressed in fine linen, wore the gold chain of high office, and carried himself with the authority of one accustomed to making decisions that affected the lives of nations. What they did not recognize was that beneath the Egyptian dress and the marks of high office, this was the same 17-year-old boy they had thrown into a pit in the wilderness of Dothan. 22 years had changed Joseph from a youth into a mature man of 39, and his Egyptian garments and clean-shaven face, according to Egyptian custom, made him unrecognizable to brothers who had known him only as a Hebrew shepherd. But Joseph recognized them immediately. Time had aged them, and hardship had marked their faces, but they were unmistakably his brothers, the same men who had once plotted his death and sold him into slavery. The sight of them awakened a flood of emotions that Joseph had to struggle to control. Following the custom for foreign supplicants, the brothers bowed down before Joseph with their faces to the ground, seeking to show proper respect to the Egyptian official who held their fate in his hands. As Joseph looked down at their prostrate forms, he remembered with stunning clarity the dreams of his youth, dreams in which his brothers' sheaves had bowed down to his sheaf, in which the sun and moon and stars had shown him reverence. The dreams had been fulfilled, but not in the way anyone could have anticipated. Joseph had indeed risen to a position where his brothers would bow before him, but it had taken betrayal, slavery, false imprisonment, and years of patient service to bring it about. The hand of God had been working through every painful circumstance to bring about this moment of recognition and opportunity. Joseph's first impulse was to reveal himself immediately, to cry out in joy and embrace the brothers who had caused him so much pain, but whom he had never stopped loving. But wisdom and perhaps divine guidance held him back. These men who bowed before him were not the same brothers who had sold him into slavery, or were they? Had the years changed their hearts as much as they had changed their circumstances? "Where do you come from?" Joseph asked in Egyptian, speaking through an interpreter as if he could not understand their Hebrew tongue. "From the land of Canaan," Reuben replied, still bowing low, "to buy food." Joseph's mind raced as he considered how to handle this extraordinary situation. The moment he had unconsciously been preparing for during all his years in Egypt, had finally arrived, but he needed time to understand his brothers' hearts and to test whether they had truly changed from the men who had once been capable of such cruelty. "You are spies," Joseph declared suddenly, his voice carrying the authority of his office. "You have come to see the nakedness of the land." The accusation struck the brothers like a physical blow. They raised their heads in alarm, their faces showing genuine fear and confusion. "No, my lord," they protested in unison, their voices carrying the desperation of men whose lives might depend on convincing this powerful Egyptian of their innocence. "Your servants have come to buy food. We are all one man's sons. We are honest men. Your servants are not spies." Joseph studied their faces carefully, seeing in them the fear and humility that had been so notably absent in their youth. These were no longer the arrogant young men who had sold their brother into slavery, but mature men who had been humbled by life and marked by suffering. But Joseph was not ready to reveal himself yet. There were tests to be made, lessons to be learned, and most importantly, he needed to know what had become of his father and his youngest brother Benjamin, who was not among the 10 who had come to Egypt. "No," Joseph insisted, maintaining his stern official demeanor, "but you have come to see the nakedness of the land." The brothers looked at each other in growing panic, realizing that their mission had taken a dangerous turn. Being accused of espionage in a foreign land was a capital offense, and they were completely at the mercy of this Egyptian official who seemed determined to believe the worst about them. "Your servants are 12 brothers," Judah said desperately, taking on the role of spokesman that he would hold throughout their dealings with Joseph, "the sons of one man in the land of Canaan, and in fact, the youngest is with our father today, and one is no more." The phrase, "one is no more," struck Joseph's heart like an arrow. So this was how they explained his absence, not as a brother sold into slavery, but as one who had simply ceased to exist. Perhaps they truly believed he was dead, or perhaps this was how they had learned to live with their guilt. Joseph continued to press his accusations, demanding proof of their claims, and eventually insisting that one brother returned to Canaan to bring back the youngest, while the others remained in prison as hostages. The psychological pressure he applied was intense, but purposeful. He needed to see how they would react under stress, whether they would abandon each other as they had once abandoned him. "By this you shall be tested," Joseph declared with the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "By the life of Pharaoh, you shall not leave this place unless your youngest brother comes here." As the brothers were led away to prison, their hearts filled with despair and confusion, Joseph retreated to his private chambers and wept. The reunion he had dreamed of for so many years had finally come, but it was proving more complex and emotionally difficult than he had ever imagined. The wheels of divine justice and redemption had been set in motion, and the story that had begun with jealousy and betrayal in the hills of Canaan was approaching its climax in the grain storehouses of Egypt. The dreamer had become the dream's fulfillment, and the time of testing and ultimate reconciliation had begun. As we reach the end of this sacred narrative, let us pause in the silence of contemplation to consider the profound mysteries that have been revealed through the life of Joseph, the dreamer whose journey took him from the beloved son of Jacob to the Savior of nations. In the unfolding of his story, we see reflected the eternal truths about the nature of God's love, the purpose of suffering, and the ultimate triumph of divine providence over human frailty. Joseph's tale is, at its heart, a meditation on the mysterious ways in which the Almighty works through the broken vessels of human experience to accomplish His perfect will. When we first encountered the young man in his coat of many colors, dreaming dreams that seemed to speak of glory and dominion, we could not have imagined the dark valleys through which those dreams would lead him. the pit where his brothers cast him, the chains of slavery that bound him, the prison walls that confined him. Each of these apparent defeats was actually a step toward the fulfillment of purposes too great for mortal understanding. In the betrayal by his brothers, we see reflected our own capacity for jealousy and cruelty, the ways in which the human heart can be corrupted by envy and the fear of being displaced in the affections of those we love. Yet even this betrayal, painful and unjust as it was, became the instrument through which God positioned Joseph for his ultimate calling. The very brothers who sought to thwart his destiny became unwitting servants of its fulfillment. The years of slavery in Potiphar's house taught Joseph lessons that no palace education could have provided. He learned to serve with excellence in circumstances not of his choosing, to maintain integrity when compromise would have been easier, and to trust in God's favor even when human favor failed him. The false accusation that sent him to prison tested his character in the crucible of injustice, proving that his righteousness was not dependent on recognition or reward, but was rooted in an unshakable relationship with the God of his fathers. In the darkness of the prison, Joseph discovered that ministry is not confined to places of honor and comfort, but can flourish wherever there are hearts that need healing and hope. His gift for interpreting dreams became a source of blessing even to those who shared his chains, demonstrating that God's calling on our lives cannot be confined by circumstances or limited by the opinions of others. The elevation to power that came through Pharaoh's dreams reveals the ultimate vindication that awaits those who remain faithful to their calling despite opposition and delay. Joseph's rise was not the result of political maneuvering or personal ambition, but the natural consequence of divine preparation, meeting divine opportunity. The skills he had developed as a slave, the character he had forged in prison, the wisdom he had gained through suffering, all prepared him for the moment when he would be called to save not only Egypt, but all the surrounding nations from famine. But perhaps the most profound lesson in Joseph's story lies in his treatment of the brothers who had wronged him so deeply. When they finally stood before him, bowing down just as his dreams had foretold, Joseph's response was not one of vengeance or bitterness, but of careful, patient love. He tested them not to punish them, but to ensure that their hearts had truly changed, that the reconciliation he offered would be genuine and lasting. In Joseph's restraint and wisdom during his brother's testing, we see a picture of divine grace that seeks not merely to forgive, but to transform. The God who had sustained Joseph through every trial was now working through him to bring healing to the very relationship that had been most damaged by sin and betrayal. The family that had been torn apart by jealousy and hatred would be restored through the agency of the one who had suffered most from its brokenness. The dreams that had begun this story, visions of sheaves bowing down and celestial bodies showing reverence, were fulfilled not for Joseph's personal glorification, but for the preservation of the covenant people through whom God's ultimate redemption would come. In saving his family from famine, Joseph was participating in the great plan of salvation that would eventually bring forth the Messiah, who would save all humanity from a spiritual famine far more deadly than any lack of physical bread. As we contemplate Joseph's journey from the pit to the palace, from the slave markets of Memphis to the throne room of Pharaoh, we are reminded that our own lives are part of a tapestry whose full pattern we cannot see from our limited earthly perspective. The threads of suffering and joy, loss and gain, betrayal and redemption are all being woven together by hands infinitely more skilled than our own, creating a picture of beauty and purpose that will only be fully revealed in eternity. Joseph's story teaches us that no experience is wasted in the economy of God, that every trial we endure can become a tool for His purposes if we submit ourselves to His will with faith and patience. The very circumstances that seem to work against us may be the means by which He prepares us for a calling we cannot yet imagine. The betrayals that wound us most deeply may become the instruments of our greatest ministry to others who have suffered similar pain. The dreams that God gives us in the seasons of youth and hope are not necessarily meant to be fulfilled quickly or in the ways we expect. Often, the vision serves not as a roadmap, but as an anchor, holding us steady through the storms of life and reminding us that our ultimate destiny lies not in the circumstances of today, but in the eternal purposes of heaven. In the silence of this moment, as we close the pages of Joseph's earthly story, let us remember that his tale continues to unfold in every life that chooses faith over bitterness, service over self-pity, and trust in divine providence over dependence on human understanding. The God who spoke to Joseph in dreams still speaks to us today, calling us to participate in his great work of redemption and restoration. May we, like Joseph, learn to see his hand at work even in our darkest hours, trusting that he is weaving all things together for good according to his perfect will. May we find in our own pits and prisons not reasons for despair, but opportunities for growth and preparation. And may we, when our own moments of elevation and influence come, use them not for personal aggrandizement, but for the blessing of others and the glory of his holy name. The coat of many colors lies buried in the dust of ancient sorrows, but the dreams it represented live on in every heart that dares to believe that God's purposes cannot be thwarted by human failure, that his love cannot be diminished by earthly rejection, and that his promises will be fulfilled in ways more wonderful than we can ask or imagine. In the quiet of this sacred meditation, we rest in the peace that comes from knowing that our lives, like Joseph's, are held in hands that will never let us go, guided by wisdom that sees the end from the beginning, and sustained by love that will not rest until every tear is wiped away and every broken thing is made whole. The dreamer's journey is complete, but the God of the dreamer continues to work, continues to call, continues to transform pits into platforms and prisons into places of preparation for the glory that awaits all who trust in his unfailing love. Amen. Let it be so.